The early 20th century also saw the rise of letter-writing manuals sold in bookstores, offering templates for nearly every situation: proposals of marriage, expressions of condolence, letters of introduction, business correspondence. These manuals reflected anxieties about proper communication. To write poorly was to risk misunderstanding or social embarrassment. To write well was to demonstrate refinement and education. Letters were not only emotional artifacts, but markers of identity and status. In this world, the silence between letters carried immense significance. To write and not receive an answer could be devastating. To wait weeks only to receive a curt or ambiguous reply could throw lives into turmoil. The delay of the postal system created space for doubt, longing, and mistrust. Yet this very uncertainty also gave letters their power. They demanded patience, resilience, and faith. They forced people to articulate their emotions carefully and to endure the vulnerability of sending those emotions into the world without guarantee of return. In retrospect, the cultural weight of letters in early 20th century America reflects a society balanced between tradition and transformation. Industrialization and migration were reshaping the country, yet human connection still relied on paper and ink. Love, family, politics, and memory all passed through the fragile medium of letters. They were intimate yet exposed, deliberate yet unpredictable, permanent yet vulnerable to fire loss or interception. To study these letters today is to glimpse a world where communication was slower but often deeper, where words carried gravity because they demanded effort, time, and risk. In the silence between letters, people learned patience. In the ink on paper, they inscribed not only messages, but fragments of their very selves. Between silence and ink, Americans of the early 20th century built lives of love, longing, and connection that still speak to us through the fragile pages they left behind. In the early years of the 20th century, before the constant hum of telephones filled American households, before the radio became a companion in living rooms, and decades before the internet redefined communication, the letter was the central thread that tied lives together, across farms and small towns, across bustling industrial cities and immigrant neighborhoods. Paper and ink carried voices over distances that could not otherwise be bridged. To hold a letter was to hold a piece of another person's time, emotions, and presence. A letter was not simply a note. It was an object of weight and significance, shaped by ritual and social meaning. In America, the very act of writing a letter reflected education, status, and identity. Penmanship was taught rigorously in schools, and etiquette manuals dictated not only how a letter should be written, but also how it should be folded, sealed, and addressed. For young men and women navigating the delicate boundaries of courtship, the letter became the safest and yet riskiest form of intimacy. Words preserved on paper could outlast a glance or whispered conversation. They could be cherished, reread, and held close. But they could also be intercepted, misunderstood, or used against the writer in ways spoken words rarely could dot. At the turn of the century, America was still a nation of great distances. Families scattered across states relied on letters to keep ties alive. Immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic from Italy, Poland, or Ireland wrote back home in hopes of sustaining bonds with relatives they might never see again. Soldiers stationed at distant posts, salesmen traveling on the expanding railroad networks, and farm workers seeking employment in industrial cities all depended on the postal service. The simple envelope connected parents to children, lovers to each other, and communities to distant homelands. Yet letters carried more than information. They carried emotional weight. A page written in familiar handwriting could evoke comfort, longing, or dread. The wait for a reply created a unique rhythm of human connection. Weeks, sometimes months, might pass before an answer returned, forcing writers and readers into long stretches of hope, doubt, and speculation. A letter's silence spoke as loudly as its words. To not receive a reply was itself a message sometimes devastating, sometimes a test of patience. Courtship in the early 20th century was closely monitored by families and communities. Direct conversations between young men and women were often restricted, making letters one of the few ways to exchange private thoughts. This intimacy, however, came with risk. If discovered, a letter could reveal feelings that social norms demanded remain unspoken. A misplaced envelope might spark scandal, provoke parental intervention, or threaten reputations. It was not uncommon for families to confiscate correspondence, especially if they suspected a romance crossed class, religious, or ethnic boundaries. Letters, therefore, existed in a paradox. They were deeply personal, yet dangerously permanent. The very language of these letters reflected restraint and coded meaning. Etiquette guides advised writers to avoid overly direct expressions of passion, urging modesty and decorum. Still, writers often developed subtle codes. Phrases such as, "I hope this letter finds you well," or "thinking of you," often carried layers of implication, especially when repeated over time. A seemingly harmless line could contain a universe of longing, visible only to its intended reader. The act of interpretation was as important as the act of writing. This culture of reading between the lines created fertile ground for misinterpretation. Without tone of voice, facial expression, or immediate clarification, readers often imposed their own emotions onto words. A delayed reply might be seen as rejection. A phrase intended as polite formality might be read as indifference. Couples and families navigated these ambiguities, experiencing moments of joy when words aligned with expectations, and moments of despair when silence or uncertainty left too much to imagination. Letters were also bound by material realities. Paper, ink, and postage carried costs, and though small, they mattered in working-class families. The penny postcard became popular in the early 1900s, offering a cheaper way to send short notes, though these were less private. For intimate correspondence, envelopes remained the preferred medium. The growing efficiency of the U.S. Postal Service, strengthened by the 1863 introduction of free city delivery and rural free delivery in 1896, meant that by the early 20th century, Americans had unprecedented access to postal communication. Yet speed was still relative. A message from New York to San Francisco could take days, from Chicago to a small rural town, perhaps longer. International letters could stretch into months. The passage of time became a silent participant in every exchange. The anticipation of the mail became part of daily life. In households across America, children were sent to fetch the post, workers checked mailboxes on their way home, and entire neighborhoods knew the schedule of the postman. A letter's arrival could lift spirits, bring news of opportunity, or break hearts with word of tragedy. It was not unusual for families to gather around and read letters aloud, especially those arriving from distant relatives. Yet personal or romantic letters were often guarded fiercely, hidden away in boxes, drawers, or beneath mattresses. The permanence of letters also made them repositories of memory. Lovers often tied bundles of correspondence with ribbon, preserving them as tangible proof of affection. Parents saved their children's letters as keepsakes, and immigrants held on to fragile envelopes from overseas as tokens of home. At the same time, this permanence created danger. A letter could be discovered years later, unearthing secrets long buried. For this reason, some chose to burn correspondence, erasing traces of emotions society deemed improper. The destruction of letters was itself a ritual, an acknowledgement of the double-edged power of ink and paper. Psychologically, the act of writing a letter shaped emotion itself. To sit at a desk, dip a pen into ink, and commit words to paper required deliberation. Unlike spoken words, which vanished in an instant, letters demanded structure and intention. Writers often revised their thoughts before committing them, producing a kind of self-reflection that shaped how relationships evolved. The letter thus became both an act of communication and an act of self-creation. Waiting for a reply deepened this psychological dimension. In the weeks of silence between letters, individuals constructed entire narratives in their minds. What had the other person thought upon reading the words? Were they touched, offended, indifferent? This uncertainty heightened emotional intensity, making the eventual arrival of a reply either profoundly relieving or devastating. For many, this cycle of anticipation and response became the heartbeat of long-distance relationships. The cultural centrality of letters in early 20th century America can also be measured by their role in major events. During World War I, for example, the US government recognized the psychological necessity of correspondence for soldiers and their families. Entire postal systems were mobilized to ensure delivery to the front lines. For soldiers, letters were a lifeline, connecting them to the world they were fighting for. For families, the arrival of a letter confirmed survival, even if only for a day. The absence of a letter could unleash weeks of fear. Beyond war, letters played roles in social movements and politics. Suffragists used correspondence to organize, mobilize, and sustain campaigns for women's voting rights. Labor activists wrote letters to newspapers and fellow workers, spreading ideas of solidarity. African American communities, especially during the Great Migration, used letters to navigate relocation, share opportunities, and maintain networks between the rural South and urban North. Each letter in these contexts was not only personal, but part of a broader historical transformation. At the dawn of the 20th century, love in America was rarely left to chance. Courtship, the delicate process of meeting, courting, and eventually marrying, unfolded within a strict framework of social expectations. Families, communities, and entire cultural traditions stood behind the young men and women who sought to navigate the narrow path between affection and propriety. Every glance, every conversation, every letter, and every visit carried weight, and every action was observed, commented on, and often judged. To understand marriage in the early 1900s, one must first understand the elaborate system of rules that defined courtship. Courtship was not simply about two individuals. It was about families, property, religion, and reputation. In urban centers such as New York, Boston, and Chicago, as well as in rural towns stretching from the Midwest to the South, society dictated that courtship was less a private pursuit of love and more a public negotiation of suitability. For many, especially in immigrant and working-class communities, a match was a means of economic survival and social respectability. In wealthier circles, it was about consolidating influence and maintaining social boundaries. Yet, across class lines, the rituals of courtship carried the same underlying message. Love was to be pursued, but only within clearly defined limits. The first stage of courtship often began not with the young couple themselves, but with their families. Introductions were rarely casual. They were orchestrated, supervised, and carefully evaluated. A young woman of respectable standing could not simply meet a man in public without a proper introduction. Through a mutual acquaintance or family member, social gatherings, church events, and community functions were considered appropriate spaces for these introductions. Even in bustling city streets or new workplaces opened by industrialization, where chance encounters became more common, propriety demanded that relationships begin under the watchful eye of society. Once a young man was introduced to a young woman, he could not freely pursue her company. Etiquette manuals of the period outlined specific rules. He was expected to call upon her at her home, to present himself politely, and to be received under the supervision of her parents, often in the family parlor. The parlor itself became a symbolic stage for early romance, where conversations unfolded under the gaze of chaperones. Chairs were placed strategically to ensure distance, and visits were rarely unobserved. This ritual of the parlor call was deeply ingrained in American households, and for many, it defined the earliest memories of courtship. The chaperone was central to these traditions. A young woman was rarely permitted to be alone with a man who was not a family member. Whether walking in a park, attending a dance, or sitting in a parlor, a mother, aunt, or trusted friend would accompany her. The presence of a chaperone was not only about protecting virtue, but also about safeguarding reputation. Gossip could be as damaging as actual scandal. A young woman seen too often in the company of one man without proper oversight could find her character questioned. In a society where a woman's marriage prospects depended heavily on her perceived purity and respectability, reputation was everything. For men, too, etiquette imposed obligations. A suitor was expected to behave with honor, to demonstrate seriousness of intent, and to respect the boundaries set by a woman's family. The notion of a gentleman caller carried with it both privilege and responsibility. Flowers, small tokens, and polite conversation were acceptable gestures. Aggressive advances or impropriety could lead to social disgrace. Courtship was as much a test of character as it was of affection. The language of courtship extended beyond actions to objects and symbols. Flowers carried coded meanings: roses for love, lilies for purity, violets for modesty. Fans, gloves, and handkerchiefs also became part of a subtle system of signals. Manuals of etiquette instructed young women on how to use these objects to communicate interest or disinterest without words. A fan held across the cheek might signal flirtation, while one snapped shut could indicate dismissal. These gestures, though often exaggerated in later romanticized accounts, reflected the careful choreography of a society where direct speech was limited by convention. Courtship was also shaped by religion and ethnicity. Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish communities all brought their own traditions to America's social fabric. In immigrant neighborhoods, parents often played an even stronger role, ensuring that their children married within their faith or cultural group. Irish, Italian, and Polish families in cities like New York or Chicago guarded against unsuitable matches, while Jewish communities emphasized religious continuity. This made interfaith or intercultural romances fraught with tension, sometimes dividing families or provoking community scandal. Yet beneath the surface of these restrictions, young people found ways to assert their individuality. Letters became a private channel of communication. allowing couples to express emotions more freely than they could under the eye of a chaperone. The growth of the postal system and affordable stationery made correspondence a lifeline for many romancers. Even so, the risks of discovery remained high. Parents often intercepted letters, and the permanence of ink made words difficult to deny. The balance between intimacy and danger defined much of early 20th century courtship. Public spaces also began to challenge older traditions. The rise of dance halls, amusement parks, and moving picture theaters created new opportunities for unsupervised interaction. While middle and upper class families clung to parlor etiquette, working class youth increasingly embraced these new venues. Coney Island in New York, for instance, became famous as a place where couples could escape the watchful eyes of family and community. The clash between old etiquette and modern leisure was a defining feature of early 20th century romance. Still, even as opportunities for unsupervised courtship grew, societal expectations remained powerful. Engagements were not entered into lightly. A man was expected to formally ask a woman's father for permission, and engagements were often treated as binding agreements. Breaking an engagement could damage reputations on both sides. Weddings themselves were public affirmations not just of love, but of a family's standing and a couple's adherence to societal norms. The tension between tradition and change defined this period. Industrialization, urbanization, and shifting gender roles created new spaces for interaction, yet the rules of etiquette continued to exert control. Women, increasingly entering the workforce and gaining access to higher education, began to assert more independence in their romantic choices. The suffrage movement and the cultural shifts of the 1910s and 1920s would eventually loosen many restrictions. But in the first decades of the century, courtship remained a carefully managed ritual. The emotional consequences of these rules were profound. For some, the structure of courtship provided clarity, security, and respectability. For others, it created frustration, stifling genuine emotion and individual choice. Many young people wrote in diaries or confided in friends about the challenges of navigating love under constant scrutiny. These personal accounts, preserved in letters and journals, offer glimpses into the human side of these traditions. The excitement of a first visit, the anxiety of a chaperoned walk, the joy of receiving flowers, the tension of waiting for approval. Courtship etiquette in early 20th century. America reveals a society negotiating between continuity and change. It was a world where love was pursued within narrow lines, where every gesture was observed, and where reputation could be made or lost in an instant. And yet, within these confines, countless men and women found ways to build lasting relationships, often transforming the very rules meant to restrict them. As the century advanced, these rules would begin to erode under the pressures of war, economic upheaval, and social reform. But in the early years of the 1900s, courtship was still a performance, part ritual, part strategy, and part genuine search for love. It was a delicate dance between personal desire and societal expectation, where silence, symbols, and supervision spoke as loudly as words. The first decades of the 20th century were years of sweeping transformation in the United States. Factories roared, smokestacks climbed into the skies of expanding cities, and millions left behind rural landscapes for crowded urban streets. Industrialization reshaped not only economies and work patterns, but also the private world of love and marriage. In the rhythm of machines, the heat of foundries, and the exhaustion of long shifts, young men and women encountered new realities, and new possibilities that would forever alter the way Americans formed relationships. By 1900, the United States had firmly established itself as the world's leading industrial power. Cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit became symbols of manufacturing might, while textile mills in New England and steel plants in Pennsylvania drew thousands of laborers. For many, this meant a departure from traditional rural communities where courtship had long been shaped by family, church, and agricultural rhythms. In the countryside, love often followed predictable patterns. Neighbors courted neighbors. Marriages united families who lived and worked side by side. In cities, by contrast, the anonymity of crowds and the proximity of strangers opened new possibilities for romance. The industrial workplace itself became a central arena of change. For the first time on a large scale, men and women worked side by side in factories, shops, and offices. Textile mills employed thousands of young women, many of them recent immigrants, who earned wages outside the home. In department stores, clerks and shop assistants interacted daily with co-workers and customers. Typists and secretaries entered offices once dominated by men. These new environments created opportunities for unsupervised contact between genders, breaking down barriers that had once kept interactions formal and heavily chaperoned. But this freedom came with complications. Working-class romances often unfolded under the harsh constraints of poverty and long hours. Factory shifts stretched 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Courtship squeezed itself into the few hours of leisure on Sundays or the rare evening off. For young men and women, the simple act of finding time to meet was a challenge. Yet, it was precisely in these rare moments of respite that love could blossom. Dance halls, public parks, and neighborhood saloons became spaces where industrial workers sought connection. The dance hall, in particular, emerged as one of the defining institutions of working-class courtship in the early 1900s. Cheap to enter and open late into the night, these halls attracted thousands of factory workers eager for music, dance, and companionship. For immigrant youth, Italians in New York, Poles in Chicago, Germans in Milwaukee, dance halls were often the first spaces where traditional parental control weakened. Away from the watchful eyes of family and church, young people mixed freely, choosing partners and building relationships based on attraction and shared leisure rather than parental arrangement. To many parents, this was alarming. Newspapers of the time ran stories condemning dance halls as immoral, associating them with drinking, prostitution, and social decay. But for young workers, they were places of freedom and choice, a break from both factory discipline and family expectation. Industrialization also altered the economics of marriage. For working-class couples, wages were central to decisions about courtship and family. A man's ability to support a household became the measure of his readiness for marriage. A woman's wages could contribute to her dowry or help sustain a new household, but cultural norms still framed her income as supplementary. Economic instability, layoffs, strikes, injuries often delayed engagements. During labor unrest, such as the Great Strikes of the 1910s, letters and diaries reveal couples struggling with uncertainty, unsure whether marriage was financially possible. Immigrant communities reflected both continuity and change in these patterns. Families from Southern and Eastern Europe brought with them traditions of arranged marriage and strict parental oversight. Yet in America's cities, their children encountered a culture that valued romantic choice. Conflict often followed. Italian daughters might meet suitors at factories or dances, challenging fathers who insisted on choosing husbands. Jewish sons might pursue love matches, despite pressure to marry within tight-knit religious networks. These generational tensions played out in kitchens, boarding houses, and union halls across the country, shaping not only family dynamics, but also the broader evolution of American marriage. Industrialization also brought gender roles into sharper focus. While men were expected to serve as providers, women's entry into wage labor challenged traditional ideas of dependency. A young woman earning her own money could delay marriage, save for her own needs, or exercise greater independence in choosing a partner. Reformers and journalists of the progressive era noted with alarm that some women spent their wages on fashionable clothing and leisure, fueling a culture of courtship based on display and style. The new woman of the early 20th century, independent, wage, and socially visible, redefined what it meant to be desirable in the marriage market. Technology, too, influenced the patterns of love in the industrial age. The expansion of railroads and streetcars meant that young people could travel more easily, widening the pool of potential partners beyond immediate neighborhoods. A young man might court a woman from a different part of the city, connected by trolley lines. Postal efficiency allowed couples separated by migration or work to maintain contact through letters, reinforcing bonds across distance. The telephone, still a luxury in many households before 1920, began to play a role in urban middle-class courtship. Though letters remained dominant, the clash between working-class and middle-class courtship practices became a recurring theme of the era. Middle-class families continued to emphasize parlor visits, supervised outings, and formal engagements. They criticized dance halls and amusement parks as symbols of moral decline. Reformers even launched campaigns to regulate leisure spaces, fearing that unsupervised contact between young men and women threatened the sanctity of marriage. Settlement houses, like Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago, offered alternative recreational activities, music lessons, reading rooms, supervised clubs, designed to steer youth away from what reformers considered dangerous environments. But these efforts often failed to compete with the allure of dance, music, and freedom, despite moral opposition. The industrial age undeniably democratized romance. Love was no longer confined to the drawing rooms of the wealthy, or the arranged matches of immigrant parents. It spilled into crowded city streets, factory floors, and neon-lit dance halls. Working-class men and women carved out spaces of intimacy in lives dominated by labor. Their choices reflected not only personal desire, but also the broader economic and cultural transformations of the age. The consequences of these shifts were visible in marriage patterns. Data from the early 20th century show rising rates of marriages based on personal choice rather than family arrangement. Couples married later than in previous generations, often waiting until wages allowed them to sustain households. Divorce rates, though still low by modern standards, began to rise slowly, reflecting both the pressures of economic hardship and the growing expectation that marriage should fulfill emotional as well as practical needs. Industrialization also shaped how love and marriage were represented in popular culture. Songs, vaudeville performances, and the new medium of cinema depicted working-class romances in ways that both reflected and influenced reality. Films of the 1910s and 1920s often portrayed factory girls swept into love affairs with clerks or laborers, echoing the lives of audiences who watched them. These cultural products reinforced the idea that love could emerge in industrial spaces and that romance, despite the grinding demands of labor, remained central to human experience. Ultimately, love in the industrial age was a negotiation between constraint and possibility. Factories imposed discipline, poverty delayed marriage, and communities enforced moral codes. Yet industrialization also opened doors. Women earning wages, men meeting partners outside family circles, couples building relationships in public leisure spaces. The industrial city, with all its noise, smoke, and struggle, became a stage on which love adapted to modernity. By the 1920s, these changes were unmistakable. The rise of the flapper, the growing presence of women in universities, and the spread of modern entertainment accelerated transformations that began in the factories and dance halls of the early century. Courtship was no longer bound exclusively by parlor rules. It had absorbed the energy, diversity, and contradictions of the industrial age. Love, like labor, had become part of the machinery of modern life, shaped by forces larger than the individual, yet still driven by the universal human desire for connection. The story of love and marriage in early 20th century America cannot be told without the voices of immigrants. Between 1880 and 1924, more than 23 million people arrived in the United States, reshaping the nation's cities, industries, and cultural life. They brought with them languages, traditions, and customs, but they also faced the challenge of adapting to a society that valued individual choice in romance and marriage. For millions of immigrant families, love became a site of negotiation between the old world and the new dot in New York's Lower East Side. Italian, Jewish, and Eastern European communities lived in tenements that bustled with life. In Chicago, Polish and Bohemian neighborhoods thrived beside factories and stockyards. In San Francisco, Chinatown remained both a refuge and a contested space for Chinese immigrants, while Japanese families settled in the Pacific Northwest. These enclaves became cultural anchors, but within them, the expectations of courtship and marriage often diverged sharply from mainstream American norms. For many immigrant families, marriage remained a collective decision rather than a purely personal one. Arranged marriages were common, particularly among Italians, Greeks, and Eastern European Jews. Parents viewed marriage as a bond between families, an alliance that could secure economic stability and preserve cultural traditions. Love, though not irrelevant, was often secondary to duty. A daughter's marriage might secure a dowry, relieve her parents of economic responsibility, or strengthen ties within the community. Sons were expected to marry women who shared their faith and cultural background, ensuring continuity across generations. Yet the realities of American life complicated these expectations. In the factories, sweatshops, and boarding houses of industrial cities, young men and women encountered a broader social world. For daughters, especially, wage labor created new independence. A young Italian seamstress in New York, a Jewish garment worker in Chicago, or a Polish domestic servant in Boston could earn her own money, choose her clothing, and spend time in spaces beyond the family home. These changes gave immigrant women more freedom to resist parental authority, particularly in matters of romance. The conflict between arranged expectations and personal choice is vividly recorded in the letters and memoirs of the time. Many second-generation immigrants expressed resentment at what they saw as outdated customs. In Italian-American families, daughters sometimes rejected arranged matches, insisting on marrying for love. Jewish immigrants debated the balance between traditional matchmaking, the role of the shah or matchmaker, and the American emphasis on love matches. These tensions could lead to bitter family disputes, estrangements, or compromises in which parents reluctantly gave way to their children's wishes. Religious identity played a decisive role in these struggles. Catholic and Jewish families in particular were deeply concerned with preserving faith through marriage. Mixed marriages, whether Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Christian, or across ethnic lines, were often condemned as betrayals of tradition. Priests, rabbis, and community leaders reinforced these boundaries, warning of the dangers of assimilation and the erosion of cultural values. Still, in the anonymity of American cities, interfaith romances did occur. Diaries and court records reveal both the heartbreak of families torn apart by forbidden love and the gradual blending of communities that would characterize later generations. Gender expectations further complicated immigrant courtship. In many traditional cultures, a woman's honor was linked to her chastity and obedience, making parental control over her movements strict. Yet in America, daughters encountered peers with more freedom, particularly those raised in Protestant or native-born households. The sights of American girls attending dances, walking unchaperoned with young men, or choosing their own partners created both fascination and conflict. Some immigrant daughters embraced these freedoms, while others found themselves caught between loyalty to family and the allure of American independence. Men, too, faced pressures. For immigrant sons, the expectation to provide financially before marriage was often difficult. In a labor market marked by instability and discrimination, delayed marriages were common, as men saved money to establish households. In some communities, this led to prolonged bachelorhood, boarding house living, or the phenomenon of picture brides, particularly among Japanese immigrants, where women were sent from Japan to marry men they had never met in person. These unions were shaped by both necessity and tradition, but they also highlight the creativity with which immigrant communities adapted old customs to new circumstances. Letters once again played a central role. Immigrants wrote across oceans, maintaining ties to families and negotiating marriages from afar. Italian and Greek immigrants often corresponded with relatives in their home villages, arranging introductions or securing dowries. Jewish immigrants wrote to matchmakers in Eastern Europe, requesting potential brides. These letters carried not only logistical details but also emotional weight, bridging worlds divided by geography and culture. For many, they became the first step in romances that combine tradition with adaptation. Courtship among immigrants also reflected broader cultural debates about assimilation. Progressive reformers, settlement house workers, and journalists frequently commented on immigrant romances, often with condescension. They saw the persistence of arranged marriages as backward, contrasting them with what they considered modern American ideals of romantic choice. At the same time, they worried that immigrant youth embracing dance halls and movies were abandoning all restraint. Reformers tried to guide immigrants toward a middle path, preserving respectability while embracing American-style independence. Popular culture amplified these tensions. Ethnic newspapers debated the virtues of tradition versus modernity. Plays performed in Yiddish theaters, Italian opera houses, and community halls often dramatized the clash between old-world parents and new-world children in matters of love. These stories resonated deeply, reflecting the lived experiences of audiences caught between two worlds. The immigrant stage became a mirror of the heart, dramatizing the universal question: should one marry for love or for duty? Despite conflict, immigrant marriages often reflected resilience and adaptation. Many couples successfully blended cultural traditions with American practices, creating hybrid rituals that honored both past and present. Weddings became showcases of this blending: Catholic ceremonies with American-style receptions, Jewish unions with English-language vows, Italian feasts held in rented halls that mixed traditional foods with American music. In these moments, immigrant communities forged new cultural identities, shaped as much by love as by labor. The impact of these romances extended beyond individuals. Marriage patterns influenced the survival of cultural traditions, the pace of assimilation, and the shape of neighborhoods. Communities that insisted on endogamy, marriage within the group, maintained linguistic and cultural cohesion for longer. Those more open to intermarriage blended more quickly into American society. By the 1920s, census data revealed rising rates of interethnic and interfaith marriages, especially in cities. This reflected not the abandonment of tradition, but the gradual weaving of immigrant hearts into the larger fabric of America at the same time. The United States government and mainstream society often viewed immigrant romances with suspicion. Anti-immigrant sentiment, reflected in the Immigration Act of 1924, framed immigrants as threats to American identity. Marriages across ethnic or racial lines faced both legal and social barriers. Laws in many states prohibited interracial marriage, targeting Chinese, Japanese, and African American unions. Immigrants who dared to cross these lines faced ostracism, legal consequences, and violence. Love across cultures, while celebrated in some circles, was dangerous in others. The human side of these stories is preserved in fragments: letters tucked into family trunks, oral histories recorded by descendants, court documents that reveal disputes, and photographs of wedding parties standing proudly in new suits and dresses. They tell of daughters who defied fathers, sons who compromised with mothers, couples who eloped, and families who reconciled across divides. In each case, love became the arena where the pressures of tradition and the promises of America collided. By the end of the 1920s, immigrant communities had reshaped American ideas of courtship and marriage as much as America had reshaped theirs. The children of immigrants, raised in both cultures, would go on to marry more freely, blending old world respect for family with new world ideals of choice. Their stories remind us that the history of love is also the history of adaptation, a negotiation between identity and desire, between cultural inheritance and personal freedom. In early 20th century America, the letter was not only a tool of intimacy, but also a vessel of defiance. Beneath the surface of neatly folded paper and carefully chosen words lay secrets that challenged social expectations. In a world where propriety defined behavior, where families guarded reputations, and where laws and customs sought to regulate private lives, letters often carried words that could not be spoken aloud. They were written in ink, but they pulsed with risk. To send such a letter was to gamble with reputation, loyalty, and sometimes freedom. The postal system itself made these acts possible. By 1900, the United States Postal Service was one of the most efficient in the world. Rural free delivery, established in 1896, and the expanding reach of urban delivery ensured that millions of Americans could send and receive letters cheaply and reliably. The penny postcard and the 2-cent stamp democratized correspondence, giving even working-class families access to private communication. The scale was immense. By 1910, the Postal Service was handling nearly 7 billion pieces of mail a year. Behind this system, however, lay an unspoken truth: the government's ability to inspect, monitor, and even censor what people wrote. For many Americans, this oversight was invisible. But for those who used letters to defy society, to pursue forbidden romances, to speak openly about taboo desires, or to express political dissent, the post was both a lifeline and a potential threat. Love letters, in particular, carried extraordinary risk. In communities where parental control was tight, letters between young men and women often had to be hidden. Families sometimes intercepted mail, opening envelopes before daughters or sons could read them. The discovery of a secret romance in ink could end an engagement, divide families, or even lead to disinheritance. Stories of intercepted letters fill local newspapers and court records of the era. A young woman's hidden correspondence with a factory co-worker might be uncovered by a protective father. A married man's letters to a mistress could become evidence in divorce proceedings, where the permanence of ink served as undeniable proof of infidelity. Unlike spoken words, letters could not be retracted. Their very materiality, paper, ink, handwriting, made them dangerous. This danger was not limited to heterosexual romance. In an age when same-sex relationships were heavily stigmatized and often criminalized, letters between men or between women became lifelines of expression. They allowed for intimacy that could not be shown in public. Yet, these letters also left individuals vulnerable. If exposed, they could result in scandal, job loss, or legal action. For historians, surviving examples of such correspondence, often hidden away for decades in private, collections or archives reveal the courage it took to commit. Forbidden affection to paper, coded language became one of the ways lovers shielded themselves. Letters might speak of friendship, devotion, or companionship, but within those words lay deeper meanings. Poetic metaphors, initials, or inside references concealed emotions that could not be written openly. Some couples used elaborate codes, substituting symbols or phrases only they understood. This practice highlights the creativity and resilience of those determined to express themselves despite constraints. The US government itself took an interest in the contents of letters. Under the Comstock laws, passed in 1873, the postal system became a tool of censorship. Named after Anthony Comstock, a zealous moral reformer, these laws prohibited the sending of obscene, lewd, or lascivious material through the mail. This included not only pornography, but also information on contraception, abortion, and sexual health. Love letters deemed too explicit could fall under suspicion, as could correspondence linked to radical political movements. Postal inspectors had broad powers to open and seize letters, making the post both a means of intimacy and a mechanism of surveillance. The Comstock laws, particularly, targeted women's autonomy. Margaret Sanger, the pioneering advocate for birth control, famously clashed with postal authorities. In 1914, her magazine, The Woman Rebel, which contained information about contraception, was deemed obscene and banned from the mails. Sanger herself was indicted under the Comstock Act, and her case highlighted how the postal system was used to suppress ideas considered threatening to social order. For ordinary couples, this climate of censorship created a chilling effect, making many careful about the words they committed to paper. Yet, despite these dangers, Americans continued to use letters as instruments of defiance. Young couples eloped, leaving behind letters explaining their decisions. Lovers maintained long-distance affairs across state lines, relying on daily correspondence. Soldiers during World War I sent letters that skirted military censors, slipping personal truths into otherwise sanitized communications. Each of these examples demonstrates how the post allowed people to assert personal freedom within a society determined to control it. Even beyond romance, letters challenged social boundaries. African American communities in the early 20th century used correspondence as a means of resistance. During the Great Migration, letters carried news of opportunity from northern cities back to southern towns, encouraging families to leave behind Jim Crow segregation. These letters often contained frank descriptions of discrimination, economic struggle, and hope, words that might have been silenced in public spaces. To share such truths through the mail was an act of courage, a quiet rebellion against a system of racial oppression. Labor activists and political radicals also relied on letters to spread their message. Leaders of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, for instance, corresponded with members across the country, using the post to organize strikes and protests. But these letters, too, faced surveillance. During the Red Scare of 1919 to 1920, postal authorities seized thousands of pieces of mail linked to suspected radicals, viewing correspondence as evidence of disloyalty. Love, politics, and personal freedom all converged in the fragile form of the letter. What gave letters their enduring power was their permanence. Unlike a spoken word, which disappeared into memory, a letter could be kept, reread, and used as evidence. This permanence made letters both treasured and feared. Couples often saved their correspondence in boxes or tied bundles with ribbon, creating private archives of affection. Others destroyed them, fearing discovery. The act of burning letters was common, a ritual of protection as much as erasure. Yet, for every letter destroyed, others survived, tucked into attics, drawers, and trunks, waiting for later generations to uncover their secrets. The psychology of secrecy deepened the intensity of these exchanges. Writers knew they were taking risks. Readers knew they were holding something forbidden. This shared danger heightened the emotional charge of the words themselves. A love letter sent against parental wishes, a coded note exchanged between forbidden partners, a radical pamphlet slipped into an envelope. Each was more than communication. Each was an act of resistance, a declaration of autonomy against forces of control. By the 1920s, the world of correspondence was shifting. Telephones were slowly entering middle-class homes, and radio offered new forms of mass communication. But the letter retained its intimate, secret power. For immigrants writing across oceans, for soldiers sending words from trenches, for lovers defying conventions, the post remained the bridge between silence and truth. The risks never vanished, but neither did the determination to write today. Historians, studying the letters of the early 20th century, see more than ink on paper. They see the defiance of individuals who used the written word to carve space for themselves in a society of restrictions. They see the contradictions of a nation that prized freedom yet censored love and ideas. And they see the resilience of human intimacy, refusing to be silenced even when pressed between the thin folds of an envelope. The secrets of the post reveal a world where letters were not merely carriers of news, but instruments of courage. In their fragile lines of ink, we glimpse the countless ways Americans navigated desire, duty, and danger. These letters remind us that even in an age of surveillance and repression, people found ways to defy silence. They wrote, they risked, and in doing so, they left us a record of hearts that beat against the boundaries of their time. At the beginning of the 20th century, the road from courtship to marriage in America was marked by a series of rituals, traditions, and expectations. Engagement was the crucial step in this journey, the bridge between private affection and public commitment. It was both a deeply personal decision and a social contract, signaling to families and communities that two individuals intended to build a life together. Yet, the meaning of engagement went beyond romance. It carried legal, economic, and cultural weight, shaped by class, religion, and shifting gender roles. To study engagement in the early 1900s is to see how Americans balanced love with duty, and sentiment with expectation. The process began with the proposal, though even this moment was rarely left entirely to chance. While the image of a man kneeling with a ring in hand became iconic in later decades, proposals in the early 20th century often unfolded in more practical ways. A suitor was generally expected to first gain the approval of a woman's parents, particularly her father. This step reflected the enduring influence of patriarchal authority, especially among middle and upper-class families. To bypass parental consent was to risk scandal and disapproval. In working-class and immigrant communities, parental involvement was even more pronounced, with entire families weighing in on the suitability of a match. Once a proposal was made and accepted, the engagement marked a formal bond. It was understood as a serious commitment, more binding than the casual courtship that preceded it, though not yet as permanent as marriage. Breaking an engagement could carry severe consequences, tarnishing reputations, and sometimes even leading to legal disputes. In certain cases, women sued former fiancés for breach of promise to marry, a legal action that reflected both the seriousness of engagements and the limited protections available to women in matters of reputation and economic security. Such cases often became public scandals, exposing private correspondence and intimate details in courtrooms and newspapers. The engagement ring itself had a complex history. Diamonds had been promoted in Europe as symbols of eternal love since the late 19th century, and by the early 1900s, they were increasingly marketed in the United States, while not yet the universal expectation they would become after De Beers' famous advertising campaigns of the mid-20th century. Diamond rings were rising in popularity. Wealthier families embraced them as markers of status, while working-class couples often chose simpler bands of gold or silver. The act of giving a ring carried profound symbolism, permanence, loyalty, and a visible declaration of intent. To wear a ring on the fourth finger of the left hand was to show the world that a woman was spoken for. Engagements were not only about individuals, but also about families. In many traditions, the announcement of an engagement was accompanied by formal gatherings, sometimes lavish, sometimes modest. Newspapers carried engagement notices, listing the names of families and often emphasizing social standing. For middle and upper-class families, these announcements were a way of affirming respectability and cementing networks of status. For immigrant families, engagement parties often blended old-world customs with American adaptations, featuring traditional foods, music, and rituals alongside new practices of public declaration. Economic considerations loomed large in engagement rituals. Marriage was not simply about love. It was about establishing a household, and this required financial preparation. In many communities, the expectation was that men would demonstrate their ability to provide before an engagement was formalized. A steady job, savings, or property ownership enhanced a man's suitability. women's economic roles were more complicated. While middle-class ideals emphasized female domesticity, many working-class women contributed wages that helped sustain families and even enabled marriage. Dowries, still common among European immigrant families, reinforced the transactional aspect of engagement. A daughter's dowry might include money, linens, or household goods, given to help establish the new home. Religion shaped engagement rituals as well. In Catholic communities, engagements were often accompanied by church blessings, and breaking an engagement carried not only social but also spiritual weight. Jewish traditions emphasized contractual elements, with engagements sometimes linked to betrothal agreements rooted in centuries of practice. Protestant communities, while less ritualistic, nevertheless treated engagements with solemnity, expecting public announcements and family approval. These variations reveal the diversity of America's cultural fabric in the early 20th century, where engagement was both universal and particular, adapted to different faiths and ethnicities. For women, the engagement period was both empowering and restrictive. On the one hand, it offered security, a public acknowledgement of her desirability, and the promise of a future household. On the other, it reinforced expectations of purity, modesty, and obedience. An engaged woman was expected to conduct herself with propriety, avoiding situations that might cast doubt on her virtue. Etiquette guides warned women against overly affectionate behavior during engagements, emphasizing restraint until marriage. For men, the engagement period was often viewed as a time of responsibility to prove financial stability, to demonstrate loyalty, and to prepare for the role of husband. The length of engagements varied. Some lasted only a few months, particularly among couples eager to marry quickly once financial means were secured. Others stretched into years, delayed by economic hardship, war, or family obligations. World War I disrupted countless engagements, as men left for the front and women waited anxiously for their return. Letters between fiancés during this time reveal the strain of distance and uncertainty, with many engagements ending in heartbreak when soldiers did not return. For others, however, the war strengthened bonds, with couples marrying swiftly before deployment, treating engagement as a fragile promise in uncertain times. Engagement rituals also reflected the broader gender dynamics of the era. The act of proposing was almost always reserved for men, reinforcing male authority in initiating marriage. Yet women exercised influence through acceptance or refusal. Diaries, letters, and memoirs from the period revealed that many women weighed proposals carefully, balancing affection with considerations of stability, family expectations, and personal desire. For immigrant daughters, in particular, rejecting an arranged engagement could be a radical act, signaling a shift toward American ideals of romantic choice. Public celebrations often accompanied engagements. Parties, dinners, and social gatherings provided opportunities for families to meet and for communities to recognize the couple. These events varied widely by class and culture. In wealthier circles, engagement parties could be grand affairs, with elaborate decorations, music, and formal toasts. Among working-class families, gatherings were simpler, often held in homes or community halls, yet no less significant. In both cases, the act of celebration reinforced the social dimension of engagement, transforming private promises into public recognition. The symbolic weight of engagements extended beyond the couple's immediate circle. Employers, landlords, and community members often treated engaged individuals differently, seeing them as more stable, responsible, and respectable. Engagement signaled maturity and intention, qualities valued in an era when social reputation was paramount. At the same time, the engagement ring became a visible marker, shaping how women were perceived in public. To wear a ring was to ward off unwanted advances, to declare a status that commanded respect, but it also placed women under greater scrutiny, with expectations of behavior aligned to their new role. The fragility of engagements added drama to their significance. Breaking an engagement was rare but not unheard of, and when it occurred, it often became a matter of public discussion. Breached promise lawsuits brought the private world of romance into the courtroom, where letters, gifts, and tokens were scrutinized as evidence. These cases highlight how engagements functioned not only as emotional commitments, but also as legally and socially binding agreements. The reputational damage from a broken engagement could linger for years, especially for women, whose marriage prospects might be permanently affected by the 1920s. The culture of engagement was beginning to shift. The rise of consumerism, advertising, and mass media transformed the meaning of the engagement ring. Jewelers increasingly marketed diamonds as the standard symbol of true love, reinforcing the expectation that every proposal should be accompanied by a sparkling gem. The idea of the modern engagement, romantic, sentimental, yet also materially displayed, took root. At the same time, changing gender roles, fueled by women's suffrage and greater participation in the workforce, gradually reshaped expectations. Women gained more influence in choosing partners, and engagements became less about family negotiations and more about personal choice. Still, in the early decades of the century, engagements carried a gravitas that is difficult to overstate. They were not casual arrangements, but public declarations, binding to lives in the eyes of family, community, and often the law. They combined romance with economics, intimacy with formality, and personal desire with cultural tradition. In the rituals of proposals, rings, announcements, and celebrations, Americans expressed both their individuality and their adherence to shared norms. When the First World War erupted in Europe in 1914, few in the United States imagined how profoundly it would alter daily life, or how deeply it would transform the language of love. By the time America entered the war in April 1917, millions of men were mobilized, and millions of women were left behind to wait, to hope, and to write. Letters became the fragile lifeline between home and battlefield. In an era before instant communication, they carried not only news but also the weight of survival. Every envelope was a promise, every page a heartbeat stretched across oceans and trenches. The U.S. Army and Navy recognized, from the beginning, that mail was essential to morale. Military officials organized vast postal systems, ensuring that letters could reach soldiers across France, Belgium, and beyond. The American Expeditionary Forces, commanded by General John J. Pershing, established an entire Army postal service, handling millions of letters each week. Soldiers wrote whenever they could, in muddy trenches, in barracks, or during brief moments of rest, knowing that their words were the only connection to family, fiancés, and wives. For those at home, the arrival of a letter confirmed that a loved one was alive. Its absence invited dread. The tone of wartime letters varied, but most balanced between hope and restraint. Soldiers often downplayed the horrors of the front, shielding loved ones from the reality of machine gun fire, poison gas, and the constant threat of death. Letters described camp life, camaraderie, or the scenery of French villages. Rarely did they dwell on suffering. Women, in turn, wrote of domestic life, of harvests, factory work, church gatherings, and the rhythms of home. The unstated agreement was clear. Letters would carry comfort, not despair. Yet between the lines, the strain of separation and fear of loss seeped through. Censorship was another defining feature of wartime correspondence. All military letters passed through censors who blacked out sensitive information, troop movements, battle locations, or anything that could compromise security. Soldiers developed creative ways to convey meaning without violating rules. A casual mention of weather, for example, might indicate movement to a new region. Some used codes known only to their families. Others grew frustrated by the restrictions, their words reduced to vague reassurances. The very act of censorship added another layer of tension, reminding both writers and readers that war intruded even on private intimacy. For couples, engagement and marriage took on new urgency. Many young men proposed quickly before deployment, unwilling to leave without securing a promise. Engagement rings were exchanged in hurried ceremonies, and marriages were performed days before departure. These wartime unions reflected both love and the fear of uncertainty. For women, the period of engagement became a long vigil, waiting for letters and telegrams that might bring either joy or devastation. A single envelope could affirm a future or shatter it entirely. The war also highlighted the expanding roles of women in American society. As men went overseas, women entered factories, offices, and volunteer organizations in unprecedented numbers. Letters from women to soldiers often described these new roles, balancing reassurance with subtle assertions of independence. Some men, reading these accounts, expressed pride, while others felt unease at the shifting boundaries of gender. In the exchange of letters, couples negotiated not only distance, but also the changing fabric of their relationships. Not all wartime correspondence was about reassurance. Some letters carried devastating news. Telegrams from the War Department, brief, formal, and merciless, announced deaths or injuries. For families, the absence of a letter could be as terrifying as the arrival of one. Communities across America knew the dread of watching a telegraph boy approach their street, bearing words that no parent, wife, or fiancé wished to read. In this atmosphere, every personal letter that arrived intact became a treasure, often kept in boxes or tied with ribbon long after the war ended. For African American soldiers, letters held an added dimension. More than 350,000 black men served in the U.S. Army during World War I, many in segregated units. Their correspondence reflected not only love and longing, but also the stark realities of racism, both at home and abroad. Some wrote of the discrimination they faced in training camps, while others described more welcoming treatment from French civilians. Their letters to wives and sweethearts carried both tenderness and frustration, capturing the dual struggle of fighting for democracy abroad while enduring injustice at home. Immigrant soldiers also relied on letters to maintain ties with family across oceans. Italian, Polish, and Irish Americans wrote in their native languages, blending old world traditions with their American identities. Some letters traveled not only between battlefield and home, but also across borders, linking soldiers in France with relatives still in Europe. These exchanges carried layers of meaning: family continuity, cultural memory, and the affirmation that love survived even amidst global upheaval. The fragility of war letters is evident in their preservation today. Many survive in archives, libraries, and family collections, revealing the intimate voices of an entire generation. They speak of longing, of courage, of ordinary details magnified by extraordinary circumstances. A soldier might write of missing Sunday dinners, of yearning for a sweetheart's smile, or of dreaming of quiet evenings back home. These mundane details, set against the backdrop of war, take on profound weight. For some, the letters were the only legacy left behind. Countless women kept the correspondence of men who never returned, cherishing their words as substitutes for lives cut short. Mothers and fathers preserved the final letters of sons killed in battle, reading them over and over. These letters became sacred objects, symbols of both love and loss. They were read at funerals, quoted in memorials, and passed down through generations as reminders of sacrifice. The impact of wartime. Correspondence extended beyond individuals. Newspapers published excerpts from soldiers' letters, shaping public opinion about the war. Politicians cited letters as evidence of patriotism and morale. Propaganda posters encouraged Americans to write to him today, reinforcing the idea that letters were as essential as food or ammunition. The US government recognized the power of the written word, turning private correspondence into part of the national war effort. World War also influenced the broader culture of romance and marriage in America. The intensity of wartime separation heightened the value of emotional expression. Couples who had once been restrained by etiquette wrote with greater urgency, confessing feelings that might otherwise have remained hidden. The war accelerated marriages, altered gender roles, and left a legacy of correspondence that reshaped ideas of intimacy. In the years after the war, these changes contributed to shifting norms in courtship, engagement, and marriage throughout the 1920s. The phrase "love on the battlefields" edge captures the paradox of these letters. They were at once deeply private and inevitably public, censored and monitored. They carried comfort, yet also reminded readers of the danger that produced them. They were fragile pieces of paper, yet they bore the weight of life and death. In them, we see not only the story of war, but also the resilience of love, adapting to the harshest of circumstances. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, millions of letters had crossed the Atlantic. Many soldiers returned home, clutching bundles of correspondence that had sustained them. Many women greeted those soldiers with boxes of preserved letters, testaments to their patience and devotion. For the families who mourned, the letters became memorials, their ink outlasting the voices that had written them. The legacy of war letters endures as a reminder that in the darkest times, human beings reach for connection. Between the silence of waiting and the chaos of the battlefield, Americans of the early 20th century wrote their hearts into envelopes, sealing them with hope. In doing so, they left behind one of the most poignant archives of love and resilience in modern history. In the first decades of the 20th century, love and marriage were inseparable from the realities of economics. Courtship might begin with affection, engagements might be sealed with promises, but sustaining a marriage required bread on the table, rent for the house, and security against the constant threat of financial collapse. For millions of Americans, particularly working class and immigrant families, economic hardship was not an occasional challenge, but a daily fact of life. Marriage was a union of hearts, but it was also an economic partnership, tested relentlessly by poverty, strikes, unemployment, and, eventually, the devastation of the Great Depression. By 1900, America had become the most industrially advanced nation in the world, yet prosperity was unevenly distributed. While wealthy families in cities like New York and Boston enjoyed comfortable homes, leisure, and education, vast numbers of working-class families lived paycheck to paycheck. Industrial workers, miners, railroad laborers, and farmhands earned meager wages, often insufficient to support large families. Women's entry into wage labor as seamstresses, garment workers, or domestic servants was frequently essential to household survival. In this economic climate, the decision to marry was never purely sentimental. It depended on whether a couple could realistically establish a household. Among working-class couples, economic hardship shaped the very rhythm of romance. Many postponed marriage until a man secured steady employment, a condition that could take years to meet. Engagements stretched on, often indefinitely, while families struggled with layoffs, accidents, or debt. Diaries and letters from this period reveal the frustration of couples kept apart not by lack of love, but by lack of money. For women, particularly those in immigrant families, the pressure was acute. Parents urged them to marry men with financial stability, while their own desires sometimes pulled in different directions. The role of dowries persisted in immigrant communities, further complicating economic calculations. Italian, Polish, and Jewish families often required a dowry, whether money, linens, or household goods, as part of a daughter's marriage arrangement. These dowries symbolized a family's contribution to the new household, but also represented a financial burden. Some marriages were delayed until dowries could be assembled, while others were abandoned when families could not meet expectations. The intertwining of romance and economics was inescapable. Economic strain also influenced the structure of households after marriage. Many newlyweds could not afford independent homes and instead lived with extended family. Tenement housing in cities like New York or Chicago often held multiple generations under one roof. Privacy was scarce, and tensions between in-laws were common. Still, these arrangements provided a safety net, with shared wages and responsibilities keeping families afloat. In rural areas, farm couples faced similar pressures, often moving in with parents until land or resources became available to start independent farms. Strikes and labor unrest further tested marriages. The early 20th century was marked by violent clashes between workers and employers, from the 1912 Lawrence textile strike in Massachusetts to the 1914 Ludlow massacre in Colorado. Husbands involved in strikes often faced weeks without pay, forcing wives and children to endure hunger and uncertainty. Women played critical roles during these struggles, not only stretching meager resources, but also joining picket lines and community kitchens. Letters between striking workers and their families reveal both the strain of deprivation and the solidarity that bound them together. The Great War temporarily shifted this dynamic. As wartime demand created jobs and boosted wages, but the return of soldiers in 1919, combined with inflation and recession, reignited instability. Strikes surged, unemployment rose, and families once again felt the pressure of economic insecurity. For many couples, this period underscored the fragile link between love and survival. Marriage required not just emotional commitment, but a constant battle against economic forces beyond individual control. The most severe test came with the Great Depression of the 1930s, beginning with the stock market crash of 1929. The economic collapse devastated families across the nation. By 1933, unemployment reached nearly 25%, and those who kept jobs often faced wage cuts. Marriage rates plummeted as young couples delayed or abandoned plans for weddings. Divorce, too, declined, not because marriages were happier, but because legal separation was financially impossible. Instead, couples endured marriages strained by poverty, with letters, oral histories, and government surveys recording rising tension, frustration, and despair. Economic hardship reshaped gender roles within marriage. Men, long expected to be sole providers, often found themselves unemployed. A blow not only to household finances, but to masculine identity. Newspapers of the era reported on men's shame at failing to provide, while women's letters and diaries reveal both compassion and resentment. Many women entered the workforce, taking jobs as waitresses, clerks, or domestic servants to keep households afloat. Some husbands supported this shift, while others resisted, feeling emasculated by their wives' earnings. Marriage became a negotiation not only of love, but of survival and pride. Despite these struggles, many couples found resilience in adversity. Oral histories from the 1930s speak of marriages strengthened by shared sacrifice. Couples learned to stretch resources creatively, mending clothing, sharing housing, or bartering with neighbors. Community networks, churches, and mutual aid societies provided support, reminding families that survival was a collective as well as individual effort. Love in these circumstances was less about romance than about endurance. A partnership forged in hardship. The strain of poverty also influenced intimacy and family planning. Couples often delayed having children, fearing they could not provide for them. Birth rates declined during the Depression, reflecting the anxieties of economic instability. For those who did have children, the stress of raising families under such conditions added further pressure to marriages. Yet even here, letters reveal tenderness. Parents writing about the joy of small family moments, clinging to hope amidst deprivation. Economic hardship left lasting scars on relationships. For some, it created bitterness and conflict, leading to separations or estrangements once conditions improved. For others, it instilled resilience and gratitude, shaping lifelong bonds rooted in survival. These divergent outcomes reflect the complex ways in which money and love intersected in early 20th century America. The cultural memory of these struggles endured. Novels, films, and songs of the 1930s often depicted couples grappling with economic strain. From John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath to popular radio dramas, the theme of love tested by poverty became a central narrative of American identity. These stories echoed the lived experiences of millions, ensuring that the memory of hardship was carried forward in both art and family lore. In retrospect, the marriages of the early 20th century revealed the profound influence of economics on private life. Engagements delayed by poverty, weddings shaped by dowries, households sustained by shared labor, and unions strained by unemployment all illustrate how love and money were inseparable. Romantic ideals may have fueled dreams, but economic realities dictated outcomes, and yet, within these constraints, couples continued to choose one another, to marry, and to build families. Their letters, diaries, and oral histories speak not only of struggle but of determination. Love under strain did not always break. Sometimes it bent, adapted, and endured. In a century defined by industrial upheaval, war, and depression, the resilience of marriage itself stands as a testament to human perseverance. In early 20th century America, love letters were not only a medium of connection, but also vessels of carefully expressed passion. At a time when social conventions demanded restraint, desire often appeared not in open declarations, but in the spaces between words, in coded language, in subtle phrasing. Passion was present, powerful and undeniable, but it was veiled by etiquette, morality, and fear of scandal. To understand the emotional intensity of letters from this era is to recognize how Americans learned to write longing into acceptable forms, turning private affection into a literary art of restraint and suggestion. Social norms placed strict limits on how men and women expressed physical or emotional desire before marriage. For women, in particular, overtly passionate letters could jeopardize their reputations. Respectability was a woman's most valuable asset in the marriage market, and letters that suggested impropriety could be disastrous if discovered. Men, too, were cautioned against explicit expressions, though they were afforded slightly more leeway. Etiquette manuals advised caution. One must write with feeling, but without impropriety. This tension between longing and restraint produced a distinctive style of romantic writing, where passion was hinted at rather than declared. The language of desire often relied on metaphor. Lovers borrowed imagery from poetry, religion, and nature to express what they could not say directly. A woman might describe the warmth of spring when writing of a sweetheart's embrace. A man might compare his longing to the pull of the tide or the fire in the hearth. These metaphors allowed writers to communicate intensity without stepping outside the bounds of propriety. The very act of wrapping desire in imagery reflected the social balancing act of the time. Handwriting itself carried meaning. A hurried scrawl suggested urgency, while carefully composed script reflected thoughtfulness. Margins, underlinings, or the inclusion of pressed flowers or small tokens added layers of sentiment. To hold a letter was to hold not just words, but traces of the writer's body, the curve of their hand, the pressure of ink, the faint scent of perfume or tobacco. These sensory details transformed letters into objects of intimacy, treasured and reread countless times. Waiting intensified the power of such language. The delay inherent in correspondence gave every phrase more weight. A word of endearment might be read and reread for weeks before another letter arrived. A phrase like "I think of you" always could sustain a sweetheart through months of separation. In this way, the rhythm of postal delivery shaped the rhythm of desire itself, stretching moments of intimacy across time and distance. Desire was also expressed through repetition. Lovers often echoed the same phrases: "Yours forever," "I miss you," "Thinking of you night and day." These refrains reinforced devotion and compensated for the absence of physical presence. Diaries from the period reveal how readers clung to these repeated words, memorizing them, sometimes copying them into personal journals. In an era where public displays of affection were limited, written repetition became its own form of touch. At times, however, letters slipped into greater frankness. Engaged couples often allowed themselves more freedom, expressing physical longing in terms that would have been shocking outside the privacy of correspondence. Surviving letters from the 1910s and 1920s show fiancés writing of the ache of separation, or the desire to hold you in my arms. While still couched in modesty, these expressions reveal how engagements created sanctioned spaces for desire. The promise of marriage legitimized more open passion, though still carefully shielded from public eyes. Soldiers' letters during World War I provide particularly vivid examples of this balancing act. Separated from sweethearts for months or years, men wrote with intensity that reflected both distance and danger, while censorship limited explicit references. Many letters conveyed longing through euphemism, a yearning for home, for comfort, for the warmth of your smile. Between the lines, These phrases carried the weight of physical desire, sharpened by the uncertainty of survival. For women at home, their replies often mirrored this intensity, describing the emptiness of nights alone or the anticipation of reunion. The battlefield and the home front became linked through letters, infused with restrained passion. Coded language also served another purpose, protecting letters from discovery. In households where parents monitored correspondence, lovers developed private systems of meaning. A reference to a book might indicate a secret meeting. A mention of weather might stand in for mood. Couples used initials, symbols, or even invented alphabets to cloak their words. In this way, desire not only shaped what was written, but how it was written. A clandestine collaboration against surveillance. The line between propriety and impropriety was not always clear. Some letters pushed boundaries, and when discovered, they could spark scandal. Court cases reveal instances where passionate correspondence was used as evidence in breach of promise lawsuits or divorce proceedings. A single sentence deemed to forward could be interpreted as proof of intimacy, damaging reputations and altering lives. The permanence of ink made desire both powerful and dangerous. Cultural shifts in the 1920s began to loosen some of these constraints. The rise of jazz culture, the influence of cinema, and the image of the flapper redefined expressions of romance and sexuality. Letters from this period show increasing boldness, with women, in particular, writing more openly of affection and longing. Still, even in this more liberal climate, the art of suggestion remained central. Passion continued to be written between the lines, shaped by habit and by lingering social expectations. The study of these letters today reveals not only how individuals expressed desire, but also how society defined and constrained it. The very act of writing about longing in metaphors, codes, and repetitions reflects the cultural boundaries of the early 20th century. It also demonstrates the resilience of human intimacy, finding ways to express itself even under constraint. Desire, like love itself, adapted to the language available in the fragile pages of these letters. We see how Americans navigated the tension between public morality and private passion. Their words show that desire was not absent from early 20th century romance. It was everywhere, written carefully, subtly, and often more powerfully because of its restraint. To read these letters is to enter a world where passion lived in metaphors, where silence was as expressive as ink, and where the heart found ways to speak even when society demanded silence. In the early 20th century, marriage in America was more than a union of two individuals. It was a binding social contract, shaped by law, religion, economics, and cultural expectations. To modernize, marriage is often seen primarily as an expression of love. But for Americans of the 1900s, it was simultaneously a legal agreement, an economic arrangement, and a public declaration of conformity to social order. Love mattered, but the framework within which love was lived was defined by the contract of marriage, a contract enforced not just by courts and churches, but by communities, families, and reputations. Marriage law varied from state to state, but in nearly every case, it placed women at a disadvantage. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, still influential well into the early 1900s, a married woman's legal identity was largely subsumed by that of her husband, while reforms had begun in the late 19th century to grant women property rights and limited control over earnings. The expectation remained that men were the legal heads of households. This meant that marriage transferred not only emotional commitment but also authority. the husband as provider and protector, the wife as homemaker and subordinate partner. Religion reinforced this contractual framework. Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish traditions all emphasized the sanctity of marriage, but each framed its permanence and obligations differently. Catholic teaching viewed marriage as a sacrament, indissoluble except by death. Protestant churches emphasized moral duty and fidelity. Jewish law preserved long-standing rituals of contract, symbolized in the ketubah, which outlined responsibilities of husband and wife. Regardless of denomination, marriage was considered sacred, binding, and essential to community stability. To defy this contract through divorce or infidelity was to risk both spiritual condemnation and social ostracism. The social contract of marriage extended beyond the couple to families and communities. Marriages were seen as alliances that reflected on the honor of kin. Families closely guarded their daughters' reputations, knowing that an unsuitable marriage could tarnish the entire household. Communities, especially in small towns and immigrant enclaves, monitored marriages as measures of conformity. Respectable unions reinforced social order. Scandalous unions threatened it. Marriage thus functioned as a means of social control, ensuring individuals adhered to cultural expectations of morality, gender roles, and economic responsibility. Economics remained central to the contract. A husband was expected to provide materially for his wife and children, and failure to do so was grounds for social criticism. Wives were expected to manage households frugally, to stretch wages, and to embody thrift. In working-class communities, this often meant long hours of unpaid labor, cooking, cleaning, sewing, and caring for children. Middle-class wives were judged by their ability to create comfortable homes that reflected respectability and refinement. Marriage thus embedded individuals into the broader economic system, tying personal relationships to labor markets, wages, and property. The contractual nature of marriage became especially visible in legal disputes. Breach of promise lawsuits, though declining by the early 20th century, still demonstrated how engagements and marriages were treated as enforceable agreements. Divorce cases often revolved around accusations of adultery, desertion, or cruelty, requiring courts to adjudicate private behavior as breaches of contract. The permanence of letters and tokens became evidence in these trials, transforming personal intimacy into public spectacle. Newspapers eagerly reported on sensational cases, reinforcing to readers that marriage was not merely private but deeply public. Divorce itself revealed the rigidity of the social contract. Though rates were slowly rising from roughly 0.7 per 1,000 people in 1900 to 1.6 by 1920, divorce remained stigmatized. Laws made it difficult to obtain, requiring proof of wrongdoing by one party. Women faced particular hurdles, as courts often sided with husbands in matters of custody and property. Religious communities condemned divorce as moral failure, and divorced individuals frequently faced social exclusion. For many, the fear of scandal kept unhappy marriages intact, a testament to the binding force of the marital contract. Despite these constraints, the concept of marriage as a social contract was not static. Reform movements challenged its inequities. The women's rights movement argued that coverture was outdated and unjust, pressing for greater equality within marriage. The suffrage victory of 1920 added momentum to calls for reform, as women who gained political rights also demanded personal rights within households. Progressive reformers advocated for marriage based on partnership rather than hierarchy, emphasizing companionship and mutual respect. Though change was slow, these debates signaled the beginning of a shift from marriage as primarily duty to marriage as potentially more egalitarian. Immigrant communities added further complexity. Italian, Polish, Jewish, and Irish families often carried traditions from Europe, where marriage contracts were formalized with dowries, family negotiations, or religious stipulations. In America, these customs adapted to new legal and cultural contexts, blending Old World contractual forms with New World ideals of love and choice. This hybrid system reinforced the sense that marriage was both deeply personal and deeply institutional, simultaneously shaped by private affection and public obligation. Race also defined the limits of the marriage contract. Anti-miscegenation laws, still in force in many states in the early 20th century, prohibited marriages between white Americans and African Americans, Asians, or Native Americans. These laws framed marriage not just as a private agreement, but as a tool of racial segregation, enforcing boundaries through legal prohibition. Couples who defied these laws faced annulments, imprisonment, or exile from communities. The marriage contract, in this sense, was also a contract of racial order, reinforcing the hierarchies of American society. Marriage ceremonies themselves reflected this contractual dimension. Weddings were public events, often attended by extended family and community members, serving as both celebration and affirmation of the contract. Vows emphasized fidelity, obedience, and permanence. Rings symbolized continuity and possession. The signing of registers, the announcements in newspapers, and the formal blessings of clergy all reinforced the legal and social nature of the commitment, even in cases where love was strong. The ritual underscored that marriage was not merely about two hearts, but about an agreement witnessed, sanctioned, and enforced by society. The social contract of marriage was not without contradictions. While society celebrated ideals of romance and affection, it also demanded obedience to rigid norms. While love was encouraged, it was expected to operate within boundaries of gender, class, and race. While marriage was described as sacred and eternal, economic realities often revealed its fragility. These contradictions created tensions that shaped countless lives, forcing individuals to balance personal desire with social obligation by the 1920s. The influence of modern culture began to soften some of these rigidities. The rise of cinema, popular magazines, and consumer advertising promoted new ideals of marriage as companionship and partnership. Advice columns emphasized happiness and compatibility. Songs and films depicted love as central to marriage, rather than secondary to duty. Still, the underlying framework of marriage as a contract, legal, economic, and social, remained powerful in retrospect. Early 20th century marriage reveals how institutions shape intimacy. The language of romance and love was always intertwined with the language of duty, law, and community. To marry was to enter not just a relationship, but a system, one that bound individuals to families, faiths, and the expectations of society at large. Love gave meaning to the contract, but the contract defined the terms of love. The legacy of this period endures. Many of the structures established in the early 1900s, legal authority, gender roles, social expectations, would continue to shape American marriage for decades. Later reforms, from women's liberation to civil rights, would challenge and transform the contract, but its imprint remained. To understand marriage in the early 20th century is to see not only how people loved, but also how society demanded they love. Within rules, within roles, within the binding power of the social contract. In early 20th century America, love was fragile not only because of social conventions or economic hardship, but also because of the constant shadow of death. Life expectancy was far shorter than today, and illness, war, and accidents often struck without warning. Widowhood was a common reality, shaping the lives of countless men and women. To marry in this era was to accept the possibility that love might be cut short, leaving one partner to carry both memory and burden alone. The story of widowhood in early 1900s America is not only about grief, it is about resilience, survival, and the reshaping of family life in the face of loss. In 1900, the average life expectancy in the United States was only about 47 years. Diseases such as tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza, and typhoid fever claimed lives with relentless regularity. The 1918 influenza pandemic alone killed more than 675,000 Americans, striking down young adults in the prime of their lives. Industrial accidents were another constant threat. In factories, mines, and railroads, men died in explosions, collapses, or machinery accidents. Women, too, were not immune. Tragedies like the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York revealed how deadly workplaces could be. Against this backdrop, widowhood was not an exception, but a common life stage. For women, the death of a husband carried immense consequences. Widows were often left as sole providers for their children, at a time when women's economic opportunities were limited. Some took in boarders, worked as seamstresses, or found employment in factories or domestic service. Others relied on extended family or community networks for support. Widows' pensions were rare, except for those whose husbands had served in the military. The Civil War and Spanish-American War widows continued to receive modest government pensions, and after World War I, similar benefits were extended. But these payments were often insufficient to sustain households. The social identity of a widow was also sharply defined. In many communities, widows were expected to observe strict mourning rituals, wearing black for months or even years. Etiquette manuals outlined proper conduct, emphasizing modesty, restraint, and piety. To deviate from these norms risked criticism, as society placed widows under close scrutiny. A widow who remarried too quickly might be judged as disrespectful to her late husband's memory. One who remained single might be pitied as lonely or even suspected of being a burden. Men who lost wives faced different challenges. Widowers were not subject to the same social restrictions on mourning, and many remarried quickly, especially if they had children. The expectation that men could not manage households alone reinforced this pattern. Newspapers frequently carried notices of widowers remarrying within months of loss. For women, this double standard was glaring, yet it reflected the gender dynamics of the time. Men were assumed to need wives, while widows were expected to endure. The First World War added new layers to the tragedy of widowhood. More than 116,000 American soldiers died during the conflict, leaving behind young wives, fiancées, and sweethearts. The war also created a generation of women who never married at all, as the loss of so many young men reshaped the demographics of communities. Letters from soldiers killed in action often became the most treasured possessions of widows and fiancées, preserved as substitutes for lives that had ended abruptly. Communities erected memorials, but in private, grief was carried in silence. In the reading and rereading of final words, the 1918 influenza pandemic deepened this pattern of loss. It struck indiscriminately, leaving thousands of widows and orphans in its wake. Unlike many diseases, it disproportionately affected young adults, meaning that many marriages were shattered within their first years. Families scrambled to care for children left behind, often stretching already thin resources. In cities, newspapers were filled with death notices, while in rural communities, funerals became near-daily occurrences. Widowhood during the pandemic was marked not only by personal grief, but by the collective trauma of communities overwhelmed by death. Cultural responses to widowhood reflected both sympathy and constraint. Charitable organizations often extended help to widows, but their assistance came with moral judgments. Widows were expected to embody respectability, to avoid scandal, and to devote themselves to children and memory. Stories of widows who pursued independence, careers, or remarriage outside community approval were sometimes framed as cautionary tales. Literature and popular culture depicted widows with ambivalence, as tragic figures deserving sympathy, or as potential threats to social order if they strayed from expected roles. Yet widowhood also revealed resilience. Many women transformed loss into activism or community service. Widows of war veterans joined organizations like the American Legion Auxiliary, shaping public memory of sacrifice. Others became advocates for reform, using their experiences of hardship to campaign for labor protections, pensions, or health care. Their personal tragedies became sources of public action, reshaping society in ways that extended beyond their private grief. Children were often the silent victims of widowhood. Without fathers, many were forced into work at young ages, contributing to household survival. Mothers bore the dual burden of grieving and providing, often sacrificing personal aspirations for their children's futures. Oral histories from the period are filled with memories of children recalling their mother's endurance, women who worked long hours, scrimped on food, and denied themselves comforts to keep families intact. These sacrifices underscore how widowhood was never a solitary condition. It reverberated through generations. For widows and widowers who chose to remarry, new challenges emerged. Second marriages often blended families, creating households of stepchildren, half-siblings, and complicated dynamics. These arrangements could provide stability, but they also carried tensions, as loyalties to deceased spouses coexisted with new commitments. Communities sometimes viewed remarriage with suspicion, questioning motives or propriety. Yet remarriage was often a practical necessity, especially for those raising children. The law also shaped the experience of widowhood. Inheritance rules varied, but in many states, widows were entitled only to a portion of their husband's estates, sometimes as little as 1/3. Without property rights, widows were vulnerable to displacement or financial hardship. Legal reforms gradually expanded protections, but the early 20th century remained a period in which widowhood frequently meant poverty. Widowers, by contrast, retained greater control over property, reflecting the broader inequities of gender in marriage. Despite its hardships, widowhood also produced cultural traditions of remembrance. Widows kept photographs, rings, and letters as sacred relics, preserving memory through material objects. Cemeteries became sites of ritual, with widows visiting graves regularly, leaving flowers and maintaining headstones. In some communities, widows' groups gathered for mutual support, creating networks of shared grief. These practices demonstrate how widowhood was not only a private loss, but a public identity, acknowledged and reinforced through ritual and community by the 1930s. As the Great Depression deepened economic strain, widowhood took on even starker dimensions. Unemployed men sometimes abandoned families, leaving women in situations indistinguishable from widowhood. Communities blurred the categories of abandonment and death, but the burdens on women were the same: survival, provision, and endurance. Government programs like Social Security, introduced in 1935, would eventually reshape the landscape by providing widows benefits, but in the early decades of the century, most widows navigated hardship with little systemic support. In retrospect, widowhood in early 20th century America reveals the fragility of love in a world of uncertainty. To marry was to risk loss, and to love deeply was to risk grief. Yet in that grief, individuals and communities displayed resilience, finding ways to carry memory forward, to adapt, and to endure. The tragedies of the heart were not only personal but structural, shaped by disease, war, accidents, and inequality. And yet, within the silence of mourning and the endurance of hardship, love persisted in letters preserved, in children raised, in memorials built, and in lives rebuilt after loss. In the early 20th century, marriage in America was upheld as one of the most sacred and stable institutions of society. Yet beneath the surface of respectability, not every union remained unbroken. Infidelity, betrayal, and divorce challenged the ideals of permanence and fidelity. When vows were broken, the consequences rippled far beyond private households. Scandals erupted in newspapers, courtrooms turned into theaters of morality, and communities judged harshly those who strayed from expectation. To understand the scandals of the time is to see how fragile the balance was between love as aspiration and marriage as reality. Infidelity was perhaps the most common source of broken vows, though rarely spoken of openly. Social norms demanded silence, but whispers of affairs circulated in both rural towns and urban neighborhoods. For men, extramarital affairs were often excused as lapses in judgment, though still condemned. For women, however, accusations of infidelity could destroy reputations entirely. Gender double standards defined how scandals were perceived, with women bearing far greater consequences for the same transgressions. Court records and sensational news stories reveal how these double standards played out in practice, making female infidelity both rarer in admission and harsher in punishment. Divorce was the most visible form of broken vows, though it remained relatively rare in the early 1900s. In 1900, the divorce rate stood at about 0.7 per 1,000 people, rising slowly through the 1910s and 1920s, while still far lower than later in the century. These numbers represented a growing willingness to dissolve marriages. Divorce cases were often sensational, not only because of their rarity, but because they exposed private lives to public scrutiny. In an era when propriety defined social standing, to have one's personal conflicts aired in court was itself a scandal. The legal grounds for divorce reflected the moral expectations of society. Most states required proof of fault, adultery, desertion, cruelty, or abandonment. These charges had to be substantiated, often through letters, witness testimony, or evidence provided by private investigators. The result was that divorce cases turned into spectacles of accusation and defense, with intimate details of marriage made public. Newspapers relished these stories, publishing salacious details for eager readers. Headlines about prominent families or wealthy individuals divorcing captured national attention, while ordinary cases played out in local courts and gossip networks. Tispo scandals. Scandals exposed the fragility of America's marriage ideal. One of the most infamous was the 1906 divorce of Harry Thaw and Evelyn Nesbit, a case entangled with the murder of architect Stanford White. The affair became a media frenzy, with love, betrayal, and violence dominating headlines. Similarly, divorces among the wealthy Vanderbilts and Astors filled society columns, dramatizing the tension between public respectability and private strife. For ordinary Americans, these scandals provided both moral lessons and voyeuristic fascination, illustrating how even the powerful were not immune to broken vows. But divorce was not only a matter of scandal, it was also a matter of survival. Letters and diaries from women of the period revealed marriages marred by abuse, neglect, or alcoholism. For many, divorce offered an escape, albeit at immense personal cost. Women risked losing custody of children, facing financial ruin, or enduring social ostracism. Support networks were few, and divorced women were often stigmatized as failures, regardless of circumstance. Men, though stigmatized to a lesser extent, also faced reputational damage, especially if found guilty of adultery or cruelty. Religious communities were especially vocal in condemning divorce. Catholic doctrine prohibited it entirely, allowing only annulments in rare cases. Protestant churches varied, but many denounced divorce as a moral failing. Rabbis, too, viewed it with disapproval, though Jewish law historically provided avenues for dissolution. The shared theme across denominations was clear. Divorce was tolerated reluctantly, and those who pursued it often found themselves marginalized from religious life. This moral weight intensified the stigma surrounding broken marriages. The press amplified scandal by transforming private disputes into public entertainment. Divorce courts became fixtures in newspapers, with reporters describing testimonies in lurid detail. In cities, journalists camped outside courthouses to catch glimpses of plaintiffs and defendants. The fascination with scandal reflected broader cultural anxieties. At a time when America was modernizing rapidly with shifting gender roles, rising urbanization, and loosening traditions, broken vows seemed to symbolize the unraveling of moral order. Each scandal became more than a story of two people. It became a referendum on the state of society itself. For immigrant communities, scandals carried added weight. Families who clung to traditional values viewed divorce as betrayal not only of a spouse, but of heritage and honor. Arranged marriages, dowries, and tight-knit community surveillance left little room for separation. Those who divorced risked alienation from both family and ethnic networks, a cost many could not bear. Still, divorce did occur, especially among second-generation immigrants who embraced American ideals of personal choice. These cases often deepened intergenerational conflict, highlighting the clash between old-world expectations and new-world freedoms. Scandals also emerged outside the realm of divorce. Breach of promise lawsuits, in which women sued men who broke engagements, declined after the turn of the century, but still appeared in headlines. These cases dramatized how seriously society viewed the breaking of romantic promises. Letters, rings, and gifts became evidence in court, exposing private affection to public judgment. Such trials reminded Americans that vows, whether spoken at the altar or whispered in courtship, were considered binding contracts, and their violation was a matter of community concern. The 1920s brought new dynamics to the story of scandal. The decade of jazz, flappers, and prohibition loosened some restrictions on personal behavior, and divorce rates rose accordingly. Between 1910 and 1930, the number of divorces in the United States more than doubled. Public attitudes shifted slightly, with a growing sense that personal happiness could justify separation. Yet scandal remained, especially in smaller towns and conservative communities. To divorce was still to invite whispers, judgment, and exclusion. Popular culture both reflected and fueled these shifts. Films, novels, and plays of the 1920s and 1930s often depicted marriages in crisis, affairs, and divorces. Audiences were both scandalized and fascinated, mirroring the contradictions of society itself. Jazz Age culture celebrated freedom and rebellion, yet communities still clung to ideals of permanence and fidelity. The result was a society caught between condemnation and curiosity, where broken vows symbolized both danger and modernity. The human side of these scandals is captured in letters, diaries, and oral histories. Behind every court case or newspaper headline lay individuals navigating pain, betrayal, and hope. A woman might write of her humiliation at discovering infidelity, a man of his frustration at false accusations, children of their confusion as families fractured. These voices remind us that scandal was not only spectacle but also suffering, lived realities that left scars long after the gossip faded by the 1930s. America's relationship with scandal was evolving. The Great Depression shifted attention to economic survival, but divorce continued to rise, reaching 1.9 per 1,000 by 1940. The persistence of scandalous cases reflected deeper changes, the growing belief that marriage should provide not only duty but also happiness, and that when it failed, separation might be justified. Yet stigma endured, ensuring that every broken vow carried costs both personal and public. In retrospect, the scandals and broken vows of early 20th century America illuminate the tension between ideals and realities. Marriage was celebrated as sacred and permanent, but human frailty, social change, and economic pressures tested those ideals. Scandals revealed the cracks in the institution, exposing not only individual failures but also the limitations of a system that demanded perfection. They remind us that even in an age of restraint, passion and conflict could not be contained. The early decades of the 20th century were years of upheaval for American women. Courtship, marriage, and family life had long been defined by tradition, religion, and patriarchal authority. But between 1900 and the 1930s, women began to carve out new spaces for independence, in education, in the workforce, in politics, and in love. These shifts did not erase old expectations, but they altered them, creating a tension between tradition and change that reshaped the very foundations of intimacy. To explore women's independence during this era is to witness how the personal and political intertwined, how love itself evolved alongside the struggle for equality. At the dawn of the century, women were still legally and socially constrained. Coverture laws limited their autonomy within marriage, and cultural ideals celebrated domesticity above all. A respectable woman was expected to devote herself to home, husband, and children. Education beyond high school was rare for women, and professional careers rarer still. But industrialization, urbanization, and reform movements began to crack these structures. Women entered factories, shops, and offices in growing numbers, and with wages, however meager, came new possibilities for independence. Wage-earning women gained freedoms their mothers had rarely known. A young woman working as a stenographer in an office, a teacher in a classroom, or a clerk in a department store could afford her own clothing, leisure activities, and sometimes even private lodging in boarding houses. This economic independence altered the dynamics of courtship. No longer entirely dependent on fathers or brothers, women began to assert more choice in selecting partners. Their wages also contributed to marriages, giving them a say in household decisions, though not fully equal. These changes disrupted the older model of female dependence. Education became another avenue of transformation. Women's colleges, established in the late 19th century, grew in prominence, offering higher education to increasing numbers of women. By the 1910s, women were entering universities alongside men in greater numbers, studying subjects once closed to them. The experience of education fostered intellectual independence and broadened women's horizons. It also altered romance. Female students, living in dormitories or away from home, had more freedom to form relationships outside parental control. Love letters from this period reveal the blending of intellectual and romantic longing, with couples debating literature, politics, and philosophy alongside expressions of affection. The suffrage movement gave women's independence its most visible symbol. Decades of activism culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women the right to vote. This political victory reverberated into private life. Women who claimed public voice also claimed greater authority in personal relationships. Suffragists argued not only for political equality, but for marriages based on partnership rather than hierarchy. Though resistance was fierce, the cultural landscape shifted. A wife was no longer seen only as a dependent. She was increasingly recognized as a citizen with rights and opinions of her own. The cultural figure of the new woman embodied these changes. Emerging in the 1910s and 1920s, she was educated, independent, and often employed. She rode bicycles, attended universities, and participated in reform movements. Her presence in literature and popular media challenged old ideals of passive femininity. In matters of love, the new woman sought companionship and mutual respect rather than submission. This shift unsettled many, with critics warning that independence threatened marriage and family stability. Yet for countless women, the new woman represented aspiration and possibility. The 1920s flapper became an even more radical symbol. With short skirts, bobbed hair, jazz dancing, and cigarettes in hand, flappers embodied rebellion against Victorian restraint. They embraced public leisure, attended dance halls, and openly pursued romance. Their letters and diaries reveal a boldness of expression absent in earlier generations. They wrote of desire, excitement, and the joy of companionship without apology. Though not representative of all women, the flapper image captured the imagination of the decade, reshaping cultural expectations of femininity, sexuality, and love. Economic independence and cultural freedom also altered marriage patterns. Women increasingly delayed marriage, choosing to work or study before committing to family life. Engagements became shorter, as couples married for love rather than lengthy negotiations between families. Divorce rates rose, reflecting not only discontent, but also women's growing willingness to leave unhappy marriages. Though stigma remained, the possibility of divorce itself signaled a shift. Marriage was becoming less of an unbreakable contract and more of a partnership that could be renegotiated or dissolved. Yet independence was not without conflict. Many women faced backlash for pursuing autonomy. Employers paid women less than men, reinforcing economic dependence despite greater participation in the workforce. Critics accused suffragists and flappers of undermining morality. Religious leaders warned that women's independence threatened family stability. Within marriages, tensions emerged as wives demanded more voice, clashing with husbands who clung to traditional authority. These struggles reveal that independence was not a smooth ascent, but a contested process, negotiated in both public debates and private households. Race and class also shaped the boundaries of independence. Middle-class white women often had greater access to education and reform movements, while working-class and immigrant women faced harsher economic realities. For African American women, independence was inseparable from the fight against racism. Leaders like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell linked women's rights to racial justice, while black women navigated courtship and marriage under the weight of both sexism and segregation. Their letters and activism reveal resilience, asserting dignity and equality in love as in politics. Technology further transformed women's independence in romance. The telephone, increasingly common by the 1920s, allowed women to arrange meetings and maintain contact outside parental oversight. Automobiles, too, revolutionized dating, providing couples with unprecedented privacy. Critics denounced the moral dangers of cars, but for young women, the automobiles symbolized freedom to travel, to choose companions, and to escape constant supervision. These new technologies amplified the autonomy already unfolding in workplaces, schools, and suffrage campaigns. By the 1930s, the Great Depression tested these gains. Economic crisis forced many women back into dependence, as jobs disappeared and families prioritized male employment. Yet the memory of independence did not fade. Women who had studied, worked, and voted carried new expectations into marriages and communities, even when hardship curtailed freedom. The cultural transformation of the previous decades remained embedded in society. In retrospect, the story of women's independence in the early 20th century is not only about public victories, like suffrage, but also about private revolutions in love. Women redefined courtship, asserting more choice in partners. They challenged hierarchies within marriage, demanding companionship rather than obedience. They expressed desire more openly, embracing new cultural identities. These shifts reshaped not only individual relationships, but the very meaning of love in modern America. The legacy endures. The independence claimed by women in the early 20th century laid the groundwork for later feminist movements, but it also transformed romance itself. Love was no longer only about fulfilling duty. It became about partnership, respect, and equality. The story of women's independence is, at its core, also a story of how love changed, becoming freer, more expressive, and more modern. In the early 20th century, Americans did not express love and longing only through letters or whispered conversations. They also turned to music and poetry, cultural forms that gave voice to emotions society often kept restrained. Songs played on pianos in parlors, verses read from magazines and newspapers, and poems recited at gatherings all shaped the way men and women imagined romance. These works were not merely entertainment. They were part of the fabric of courtship, embedding love within rhythm, melody, and metaphor. To trace the music and poetry of romance in this era is to glimpse how desire, sentiment, and ideals of love were communicated, shared, and remembered. Music was central to everyday life. Before radios became widespread in the 1920s, families gathered around pianos, where young women, in particular, were expected to play popular songs of the day. Sheet music sold in the millions, carried by publishers on Tin Pan Alley in New York. These songs often revolved around themes of love, longing for a sweetheart, dreaming of reunion, or lamenting separation. Singing these songs in parlors and social gatherings allowed couples to share emotions indirectly. A young man might request a favorite tune, and a young woman, playing the piano, could signal her feelings through choice and performance. Songs like Let Me Call You Sweetheart, 1910, or I Love You Truly, 1901, became cultural touchstones. Their lyrics, sentimental and idealized, reflected the conventions of romance while allowing individuals to project their own emotions onto them. For soldiers during World War I, songs such as Keep the Home Fires Burning or Over Their connected love and patriotism, linking private longing to public duty. These melodies carried across oceans, sung in trenches and parlors alike, binding lovers through shared sound. The phonograph, increasingly popular after 1900, amplified music's role in courtship. Couples could listen to recordings of romantic ballads, creating private atmospheres of sentiment. By the 1920s, radio broadcasts extended this intimacy further, bringing love songs into living rooms across the nation. Music became a shared language, a way of expressing feelings that might be too bold or awkward in speech. The popularity of crooners like Gene Austen and later Bing Crosby reflected this hunger for musical intimacy, a gentle, melodic voice carrying the weight of desire into households everywhere. Poetry functioned alongside music as another vehicle for romance. Newspapers and magazines regularly published love poems, while anthologies of verse circulated widely. Schoolchildren memorized poems by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Edgar Allan Poe, embedding their language of love into cultural consciousness. Courtship letters frequently quoted these verses, allowing lovers to borrow elevated language for emotions they struggled to articulate. A single line of poetry, copied carefully into a letter, could carry more weight than paragraphs of prose. The tradition of sentimental poetry thrived in this period. Popular poets like Ella Wheeler Wilcox and James Whitcomb Riley produced verses filled with tenderness, longing, and moral lessons. Though dismissed by critics as overly sentimental, their works resonated with ordinary readers who found in them reflections of their own experiences. In immigrant communities, poetry often served as a bridge between languages. Yiddish poets in New York, Italian balladeers in immigrant newspapers, and Polish writers in Chicago infused Old World traditions into New World contexts, preserving cultural identity while shaping American ideas of love. Love poetry was not confined to the printed page. It was spoken aloud at social gatherings, church events, and family recitals. Young men and women memorized verses to impress potential partners, demonstrating both education and sensitivity. To recite poetry was to court not only with words, but with culture, signaling refinement and sincerity. The act of sharing poetry reinforced courtship's performative dimension, blending personal affection with public ritual. The emotional weight of songs and poems also reflected broader social constraints. In a society that limited direct expression of desire, cultural works provided safe outlets. Singing a sentimental song or quoting a passionate poem allowed individuals to articulate feelings without overtly breaking norms of propriety. Desire was embedded in melody and metaphor, coded within cultural language that society accepted. At the same time, these works shaped expectations, teaching people what love should sound and feel like. The 1920s brought new rhythms to romance. Jazz, with its syncopated beats and improvisational energy, challenged older sentimental styles. Songs like My Blue Heaven, 1927, or Ain't Misbehavin', 1929, reflected new attitudes toward love, playful, urban, and less restrained. Dance halls filled with jazz and swing became central spaces for courtship, where music and movement combined to create new forms of intimacy. Critics denounced jazz as immoral, but for young couples, it embodied modern romance, energetic, expressive, and liberated from Victorian solemnity. Poetry, too, evolved with the times. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s produced some of the most powerful love poetry of the century. Writers like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and Georgia Douglas Johnson infused romance with themes of race, identity, and longing. Their verses blended personal desire with broader struggles for dignity and equality, expanding the meaning of love poetry beyond sentimentality. These works circulated not only in black communities, but across America, enriching the nation's understanding of intimacy. Women's voices in music and poetry also grew louder. Female songwriters like Carrie Jacobs Bond, who composed I Love You Truly, carved space in a male-dominated industry. Female poets published in newspapers, magazines, and anthologies, expressing emotions that challenged conventional gender norms. Their works offered perspectives on independence, longing, and fulfillment that resonated with women navigating new roles in society. The cultural memory of romance in this era is inseparable from its songs and poems. Couples remembered courtship through melodies played at weddings, poems inscribed in letters, or songs sung at farewells. These works provided emotional continuity across distance and time. For widows and widowers, a familiar song could summon memories of lost spouses, keeping love alive through sound. For soldiers and immigrants, poetry in letters preserved ties to home and family. By the 1930s, mass media had fully absorbed romance into its cultural fabric. Radio programs featured nightly love songs. Magazines printed poems by both professionals and amateurs. And Hollywood films set new standards for cinematic romance, blending music, poetry, and visual storytelling. These cultural products reinforced the idea that love was central to modern life, not only as private experience, but as public culture. Looking back, the music and poetry of early 20th century romance reveal both continuity and change. They preserved older traditions of sentiment while embracing modern rhythms of jazz and urban life. They reflected restraint while hinting at desire. They gave voice to emotions that individuals might otherwise have kept silent. In these cultural works, love became both personal expression and shared experience, binding couples to one another while embedding their stories within the larger soundtrack and verse of a changing America. At the turn of the 20th century, Americans were moving more than ever before. Industrialization, urban growth, immigration, and war scattered families and lovers across vast distances. Where earlier generations had lived their lives largely within the same towns or farms, the 1900s brought new mobility, and with it, new challenges for romance. Couples learned to navigate absence and longing with the tools of technology, the railroads that carried them across states, the letters that bridged weeks of silence, and the telephones that began to shrink distance in real time. Love across distance was both a burden and an opportunity, reshaping the way Americans conceived of intimacy in an age of change. The railroad was the great symbol of this transformation. By 1900, the United States had built more than 190,000 miles of track, connecting cities, towns, and rural communities. Young men and women left home for work in industrial centers, and immigrants spread across the country in search of opportunity. Courtship, once local and predictable, became stretched across miles. A sweetheart might live in another town, reachable only by train journeys that required planning and resources. For couples separated by work or migration, the train station became a site of reunion and farewell, a place where embraces carried the weight of weeks apart, and where the sound of the whistle meant either anticipation or loss. Letters remained the backbone of long-distance love. But railroads allowed couples to supplement correspondence with visits. These visits were brief and precious, often framed by timetables and ticket costs. Diaries and letters from the period reveal couples describing the thrill of train rides to meet lovers, the nervous wait at platforms, and the bittersweet partings as trains pulled away. For some, railroads made romance possible across distances that earlier generations could not have sustained. For others, they were reminders of how mobility separated families, with love forced to endure through absence. The telephone introduced an even more radical shift. First patented in the late 19th century, it spread slowly at first. With fewer than 600,000 telephones in the United States in 1900. By 1920, however, more than 13 million households had access, and by the 1930s, the telephone was transforming the rhythms of courtship. Unlike letters, which required patience and carried the weight of silence, telephone calls provided immediacy. A young man could call a sweetheart to arrange meetings, to reassure her of affection, or simply to hear her voice. For couples accustomed to long waits, the intimacy of a voice carried across wires was revolutionary. Yet the telephone also created new dynamics. Privacy was limited, as most households shared party lines, multiple families connected to the same circuit. Conversations were often overheard, turning private romance into public entertainment. Etiquette manuals of the 1910s and 1920s even offered guidance on proper telephone behavior in courtship, warning against monopolizing lines or speaking too boldly. Still, for young people, the telephone became a tool of freedom, allowing contact beyond the reach of parental eyes. It marked a shift toward more spontaneous and less formal courtship, reflecting broader cultural changes of the 1920s. Technology also brought challenges. Telegraphs, though faster than letters, were reserved for urgent news, announcements of illness, death, or sudden changes in plans. A telegram arriving at a household often brought dread rather than joy. The sharpness of its words, stripped of sentiment by brevity and cost, contrasted sharply with the tenderness of letters or the warmth of a phone call. For couples, telegrams were less about love than about crisis, shaping how distance could bring sudden, jarring ruptures into romance. Distance was not only a matter of technology, but also of migration. The Great Migration of African Americans from the rural, south to northern cities between 1916 and 1930 reshaped families and relationships. Letters became vital for couples separated by geography, describing both longing and the challenges of new urban life. Railroads carried migrants northward, but for those left behind, absence stretched courtship across states. Similarly, European immigrants who had left families behind in Italy, Poland, or Ireland wrote letters that carried both affection and negotiations of marriage across oceans. Distance became both obstacle and test, shaping how love survived transitions of place and identity. World War I amplified these patterns. Soldiers stationed in Europe relied on letters to maintain ties with wives, fiancées, and sweethearts. For them, the distance was not measured only in miles but in danger, as each letter carried the possibility of being a last. Women at home waited anxiously at mailboxes, while men abroad counted days between deliveries. The postal system became an artery of emotional survival, connecting battlefields and kitchens through envelopes that crossed oceans. Here, distance magnified love, turning every letter into a testament of hope. Automobiles added yet another dimension to distance and romance. By the 1920s, cars allowed couples to escape the confines of neighborhoods, extending the possibilities of courtship beyond walking distance or train schedules. Lovers could meet halfway between towns, creating new geographies of romance. Cars also offered unprecedented privacy, transforming not only how couples met, but how they expressed intimacy. Critics decried the moral dangers of the automobile, but for couples negotiating distance, it was a lifeline of connection. Cultural representations reflected these changes. Songs like Hello, Ma Baby 1899, one of the earliest hits celebrating the telephone, playfully captured the novelty of voice-to-voice romance. Later, films of the 1920s and 1930s depicted train station farewells, long distance, longing, and reunions, embedding the imagery of separation and connection into popular imagination. Literature, too, grappled with these themes, with novelists portraying lovers separated by war, work, or migration, sustained by letters and visits. The culture of the time mirrored and reinforced the lived experiences of distance in of. Distance also created misunderstandings. Letters delayed in the post, phone calls missed, or visits cancelled due to lack of funds all strained relationships. The psychology of waiting, the silence between letters, the gap between visits fostered both longing and suspicion. Couples wrote of jealousy, of doubts, of the pain of not knowing. Miscommunications stretched across miles, sometimes breaking engagements or marriages. Yet for many, overcoming these challenges strengthened bonds, proving endurance in the face of separation. By the 1930s, love across distance was increasingly common, a reflection of America's mobility. The Depression scattered families in search of work, sending men across states for employment while wives and children remained behind. Letters once again became the primary lifeline, filled with reassurances of love and promises of reunion. For many couples, survival depended not only on wages but on the hope preserved in envelopes. Distance was no longer unusual, it was a condition of modern life, endued with patience, technology, and determination. Looking back, the story of long-distance love in the early 20th century reveals how Americans adapted intimacy to new technologies and circumstances. The railroad extended possibilities, the telephone transformed immediacy, and the automobile redefined privacy. Letters, still central, wove these tools together, carrying affection across miles and years. Distance tested love, but it also gave it new forms, embedding longing into timetables, wires, and ink. In the end, love across distance was not only about separation, it was about resilience. Couples who endured miles of absence carried forward traditions of patience and trust. Their stories remind us that intimacy has always been shaped by technology, by mobility, and by the demands of change. In a century defined by movement, Americans found ways to carry love with them on trains, in letters, through wires, and into the uncertain horizons of modern life. At the dawn of the 20th century, few events carried as much cultural weight as a wedding. To marry was not simply to join two individuals. It was to unite families, display community values, and affirm social status. In America, between 1900 and the 1930s, weddings were public rituals that reflected tradition, religion, and class. They were ceremonies of love, yes, but also of unity, identity, and display. To trace the weddings of this period is to uncover how Americans celebrated one of life's most significant transitions and how they balanced sentiment with spectacle. Weddings varied enormously by class and culture. For wealthy families, weddings were grand affairs, staged in lavish homes, ornate churches, or elite hotels. Newspaper society pages, detailed gowns, guest lists, and decorations, transforming private unions into public displays of power and prestige. For working class and immigrant families, weddings were more modest but no less meaningful, often held in small churches, community halls, or even family parlors. These celebrations might lack extravagance, but they carried immense symbolic value. The affirmation of love and stability in the face of hardship. The centrality of ritual was universal. The wedding ceremony itself, whether Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, or Orthodox, followed forms rooted in centuries of tradition. Vows were exchanged publicly, rings were placed on fingers, and blessings were spoken by clergy. These acts symbolized permanence and legitimacy, embedding personal love within religious and cultural frameworks. For Protestants, the ceremony emphasized moral duty and companionship. For Catholics, marriage was a sacrament, indissoluble and sacred. For Jews, the ketubah formalized the marriage contract, outlining obligations and responsibilities. Each ritual tied couples not only to one another, but to communities of faith and heritage. The bride, always at the center, carried the weight of symbolism. Her dress, typically white by the early 20th century, represented purity and innocence. Though Queen Victoria had popularized the white wedding gown in the 19th century, by the 1900s the custom had spread widely across America, even among modest families. Veils, flowers, and bridal processions reinforced the imagery of sanctity and tradition. For poorer families, a white dress might be homemade or repurposed, worn with pride as a sign of dignity. Photographs of brides in plain parlors, surrounded by relatives, reveal how even in modest settings, the symbolism of the gown elevated the occasion. Grooms, by contrast, were expected to embody stability and respectability. Dressed in dark suits or formal attire, they stood as providers and protectors. Their role was less about display than about assurance, the promise of financial and moral responsibility. Yet weddings also allowed grooms to assert identity, particularly in immigrant communities where traditional attire or rituals emphasized cultural continuity. In both cases, clothing and ceremony communicated expectations of gender roles within marriage, purity and domestic virtue for women, provision and authority for men. The wedding party itself reinforced community bonds. Bridesmaids and groomsmen symbolized networks of friendship and kinship, standing as witnesses to vows. For immigrant families, these roles often blended old and new traditions, with rituals carried from Europe, Asia, or the Middle East adapted to American settings. Music, dancing, and food followed ceremonies, providing moments of joy and celebration. These receptions varied from formal banquets in elite hotels to simple gatherings in parish halls or family yards. But their purpose was the same: to bring communities together in recognition of new unions. Economic factors shaped every detail. For wealthier families, weddings could be extravagant displays of consumption, with elaborate floral arrangements, multi-course meals, and expensive gifts. These events were as much about social display as about marriage itself, signaling status within competitive social circles. For working-class families, weddings often required significant sacrifice. Families saved for years to host receptions, sometimes going into debt to provide feasts or dowries. Guests contributed gifts, linens, household goods, money, helping the new couple establish households. In this way, weddings functioned as both economic exchanges and communal investments in the future. Public announcements reinforced the social dimension. Newspapers carried wedding notices, describing ceremonies and receptions, often with details of gowns and decorations. For elite families, these announcements extended reputation beyond the event, cementing status in the eyes of the wider public. For ordinary families, local notices served as recognition of respectability and community standing. Weddings were thus not only lived events, but recorded ones, shaping how communities remembered unions. The rituals of weddings also revealed the pressures of conformity. Couples who eloped, bypassing public ceremony and family approval, often faced criticism or scandal. To marry quietly in a courthouse was considered less respectable than a public ceremony. Religious leaders warned against the dangers of elopement, emphasizing the importance of community witness. Yet elopements did occur, particularly among couples defying parental authority or constrained by economics. These unions remind us that weddings were not only about ritual, but also about negotiation between tradition and individual desire. Technology shaped weddings as well. Photography, already common by the late 19th century, became central to wedding culture in the 1900s. Couples posed formally in studios or at ceremonies, creating lasting visual records. These photographs, often framed and displayed in homes, reinforced the permanence of unions. By the 1920s, candid wedding photographs captured receptions, dancing, and family gatherings, adding vibrancy to the ritual record. Radio and phonographs also influenced weddings, providing music that blended traditional hymns with popular love songs. Linking old rituals to modern culture, cultural diversity enriched the tapestry of weddings in America. Italian, Polish, Jewish, Irish, Greek, and other immigrant groups preserved customs while adapting to new contexts. Italian weddings featured multi-course feasts and music. Jewish weddings included the breaking of the glass, symbolizing both fragility and continuity. African American communities, navigating segregation and racism, created weddings that blended traditional Christian rituals with cultural expressions of resilience and joy. Each community brought its own meanings to the wedding ritual, affirming identity within the larger American landscape. The 1920s and 1930s saw weddings begin to modernize. Consumer culture influenced ceremonies as advertisements promoted gowns, rings, and honeymoon travel as essential parts of the marriage ritual. The diamond engagement ring, though not yet universal, gained popularity as jewelers marketed it as the ultimate symbol of love. Department stores offered registries, encouraging guests to buy gifts in coordinated sets. Weddings became increasingly commercialized, reflecting broader trends in American consumerism. Yet beneath these modern trappings, the core rituals remained: vows, blessings, rings, and public celebration. Weddings also carried deep emotional meaning. For couples, they were moments of hope, transition, and affirmation. For families, They were milestones that marked continuity across generations. For communities, they were collective affirmations of values. The joy of weddings was inseparable from their gravity. They were not merely parties, but rituals of unity and display, embedding private love in public form. By the 1930s, weddings had become both modern and traditional, shaped by consumer culture, religious ritual, and community values. They reflected the aspirations of couples and families, the pressures of economics, and the meanings of identity. In every lace veil, every public vow, every communal feast, Americans of this period expressed what love meant to them: not only affection, but commitment; not only intimacy, but unity; not only personal promise, but public display. A wedding in the early 20th century was not an ending, but a beginning, the formal entry into the lifelong task of building a household. For couples in America between 1900 and the 1930s, marriage was followed by years of work, compromise, and endurance. Home was both a physical place and a symbol of stability. To construct it required more than bricks, furniture, or linens. It required navigating gender roles, economic hardship, cultural traditions, and the constant negotiation of affection and responsibility. The first challenge most couples faced was housing. In cities where tenement apartments were crowded and rents high, many newlyweds began their lives in single rooms within boarding houses or with extended family. In immigrant neighborhoods of New York, Chicago, or Boston, it was common for multiple families to share kitchens and bathrooms, privacy almost non-existent. In rural America, couples often moved in with parents until they could save enough to purchase land or build modest farmhouses. Independence was the goal, but few could achieve it immediately. Household furnishings carried deep significance. For middle-class couples, department stores offered everything from dining sets to curtains, often promoted through wedding gift registries that encouraged uniform respectability. Advertisements framed the accumulation of proper furnishings as essential to building a stable marriage. For working-class couples, furniture was often second-hand, pieced together from relatives or bought on credit. Even a single new piece, a bedstead, a dining table, or a stove, symbolized progress toward independence. Household goods became markers not only of comfort but of identity, reflecting aspirations in material form. Gender roles defined the division of labor in the home. The expectation was clear: husbands earned wages and wives managed households. This division, though deeply unequal, carried cultural authority reinforced by religion, law, and tradition. A good wife was measured not only by her devotion, but by her ability to stretch meager resources, to cook nutritious meals, to sew and mend, and to raise children in moral respectability. Men, in turn, were judged by their steadiness as providers and protectors. These roles were idealized in etiquette manuals and magazines, but in practice, survival often required bending them. Many wives worked for wages, and many husbands helped with childcare or chores when necessity demanded it. Immigrant families layered their own traditions onto these patterns. Italian, Jewish, Polish, and Irish households brought customs from their homelands, blending them with American practices. Food, in particular, became central to maintaining culture. Italian wives cooked pasta and stews, Jewish mothers prepared Sabbath meals, and Polish families celebrated holidays with traditional dishes. These acts of cooking and eating together anchored homes in cultural continuity, even as families adapted to American life. The home thus became a site where love, culture, and survival intertwined. Raising children added further complexity. For most couples, children arrived quickly after marriage, as contraception was limited and often condemned. Large families were common, though economic realities often made them burdensome. Mothers carried the heaviest responsibilities, balancing childcare with household management and sometimes wage labor. Fathers were expected to instill discipline and provide income, though many also participated tenderly in family life. Letters and diaries reveal parents' pride in children's achievements, but also the anxieties of feeding, clothing, and educating them in times of scarcity. The rhythm of daily life defined marriages as much as romance did. A husband leaving for the factory before dawn, a wife tending to laundry and meals, children returning from school. These routines formed the backdrop of love after vows. Evenings were often spent together in small ways, reading newspapers, listening to music, or attending church gatherings. While less glamorous than courtship or weddings, these rhythms represented the substance of marriage, the ordinary acts through which love was sustained. Economic hardship tested households constantly. Strikes, unemployment, and illness could destabilize families overnight. Wives often took in boarders, cleaned houses, or sewed for neighbors to make ends meet. Husbands sometimes migrated for seasonal work, leaving wives to manage alone. The Great Depression magnified these strains, as countless families lost jobs, homes, or savings. Oral histories recall couples sleeping in kitchens during winter to save on heating, or sharing meals of bread and beans day after day. Yet even in deprivation, many couples found resilience, drawing strength from shared sacrifice. Religion and community shaped home life profoundly. Churches, synagogues, and mutual aid societies provided guidance, support, and moral reinforcement. Clergy preached about the sanctity of family, offering both comfort and pressure. Neighbors watched households closely, judging wives for cleanliness and thrift, husbands for sobriety and steadiness. To build a respectable home was thus not only about private satisfaction, but about maintaining reputation. For many, community approval was as important as personal happiness. Despite the hardships, love persisted in gestures, often small but profound. A husband saving pennies to buy his wife a new shawl. A wife tucking handwritten notes into a husband's lunch. Parents reading bedtime stories to children. These acts embodied affection in tangible ways. Letters between spouses who were separated by work reveal longing not only for intimacy but for the routines of home. The sound of footsteps on stairs, the smell of dinner cooking, the laughter of children. Marriage was lived less in grand declarations than in these daily affirmations. Modern technology subtly reshaped home life. Radios, increasingly common by the 1920s, brought entertainment and information into living rooms, turning evenings into communal listening. Telephones allowed coordination of household affairs and easier contact with relatives. Automobiles gave families freedom to visit extended kin, attend church, or enjoy picnics, expanding the geography of married life. These technologies altered how couples and families related to one another, introducing new rhythms into domestic existence. Women's independence also reshaped the home. The suffrage victory of 1920, rising female education, and wage labor meant that wives carried new expectations into marriages. Some couples embraced partnership more fully, sharing decisions and valuing companionship. Others resisted, clinging to patriarchal authority. These tensions played out in kitchens and parlors as much as in politics, reflecting the ongoing renegotiation of gender roles. The home was also a site of conflict. Domestic violence, though rarely discussed openly, was a reality for many women. Divorce rates slowly rose, but stigma and legal barriers often forced women to remain in unhappy or abusive marriages. Alcohol abuse, heightened during Prohibition, strained countless households. Letters, court cases, and reform campaigns reveal how these issues shaped the realities of love after vows, complicating the idealized picture of domestic bliss. Yet, for all its struggles, the home remained the cornerstone of American marriage. Couples measured success not only in romance, but in the ability to establish stability, to raise children, and to maintain respectability. The home embodied both aspiration and achievement, a symbol of love's endurance amid the uncertainties of a changing world. By the 1930s, the image of home had become deeply embedded in American culture. Advertisements, films, and magazines depicted tidy kitchens, smiling families, and devoted couples as symbols of the good life. These images often glossed over hardship, but they reflected aspirations shared across classes and communities. To marry and to build a home was to fulfill both personal dreams and cultural expectations, a goal pursued despite obstacles. Looking back, the task of building a home together after the vows reveals the complexity of early 20th century love. It was not merely about passion or ceremony, but about endurance, adaptation, and partnership. Homes were built not only of wood and stone, but of routines, sacrifices, and gestures of care. Within their walls, couples lived out the realities of marriage, sometimes joyful, sometimes strained, always shaped by the interplay of love, labor, and society. In the early 20th century, love was written down. More than photographs, more than tokens, it was letters that carried the deepest record of intimacy. Couples exchanged them across town, across states, across oceans, words folded into envelopes, sealed with stamps, and entrusted to the post. These letters were never just temporary communications. They were preserved, tucked into drawers, bound with ribbon, hidden in boxes, or placed inside family trunks. Over time, they became archives, private collections of passion, memory, and longing. To study them now is to enter the preserved heart of another age. The survival of so many love letters from 1900 to the 1930s is remarkable. They endured because people chose to keep them, to guard them as treasures rather than discard them as scraps. A single bundle might represent years of courtship, each page capturing moments of hope, separation, or reconciliation. For many couples, these letters became part of married life itself, reread during arguments, cherished during separations, or revisited decades later in old age. They functioned as both living documents and emotional anchors, bridging past and present. Why did people keep them? Part of the answer lies in the scarcity of other intimate records. Photography was still formal and relatively rare, reserved for staged occasions. Diaries were private and often destroyed, but letters were exchanges, preserved because they came from another's hand. They bore handwriting, ink blots, smudges, even the faint scent of perfume or tobacco. They embodied the physical presence of the absent beloved. To discard them would have been to discard part of that person. Archives of intimacy took many forms. Some were carefully organized, tied with ribbon, labeled by date, or placed in decorated boxes. Others were informal, left in trunks or drawers, forgotten until rediscovered by children or grandchildren. Women were often the guardians of these collections, though men too preserved letters from wives, fiancées, and sweethearts. Family law sometimes centered around these bundles, with older relatives passing them down as heirlooms, symbols of devotion that transcended generations. Not all letters were kept with joy. Some were preserved in grief, the only remnants of lovers who died young, whether in war, illness, or accident. Widows clutched letters as substitutes for voices that would never return. Parents kept the correspondence of sons killed in World War I, treasuring the last words sent from trenches in France. These letters became memorials, read again and again, their ink carrying the weight of both presence and absence. The legal world also preserved letters, often against the will of their writers. Divorce cases and breach of promise lawsuits used love letters as evidence, introducing private intimacy into public record. Court transcripts reveal letters quoted word for word, their phrases dissected by lawyers and judges. In these instances, archives of intimacy became archives of scandal, exposing what was meant to remain private. Newspapers eagerly reprinted salacious excerpts, turning personal passion into public entertainment. Historians today rely heavily on these preserved letters to reconstruct the emotional lives of early 20th century Americans. Archives in universities, libraries, and historical societies contain thousands of bundles, catalogued and studied as cultural artifacts. They reveal not only what individuals felt, but how society framed love. They show the tension between propriety and passion, the impact of distance, the influence of war, and the shaping power of gender roles. Each letter is a fragment of history, but together they form a mosaic of intimacy across decades. The language of these letters often surprises modern readers. Flowery expressions, now considered old-fashioned, carried deep sincerity. Men addressed women as my dearest, my darling, or my beloved, while women wrote of devotion, longing, and dreams of the future. Repetition reinforced sincerity. Phrases like, "I miss you," "I think of you always, and forever yours," appearing again and again. For couples separated by weeks of silence, these repeated words were lifelines, sustaining emotional connection through absence. Material culture added further meaning. Some letters contained pressed flowers, photographs, or locks of hair. Others bore stains of tears or smudges from hurried writing. The physical qualities of letters transformed them into keepsakes more than mere text. They were tangible pieces of love, preserved in ways that no modern digital message can replicate. To open a letter was to hold a fragment of the beloved's body and spirit. The preservation of letters also reflected anxieties. Many couples destroyed correspondence, fearing discovery by parents, spouses, or communities. Burning letters was a common ritual, especially for women seeking to protect reputations. Yet even here, destruction revealed meaning. The very act of burning testified to the danger and intensity of written intimacy. What survived, therefore, was selective, shaped by choices, fears, and accidents. By the 1920s and 1930s, the culture of letter writing was beginning to shift. Telephones provided new immediacy, and radio shaped new rhythms of communication. Yet letters remain central, especially for romance and family. The Great Depression, scattering families in search of work, revived the importance of letters as lifelines. Migrant workers wrote home from distant farms and towns, their words carrying love, reassurance, and longing across miles. These letters, too, were preserved, reflecting not only romance but survival. The endurance of love letters as archives of intimacy also shaped memory. Couples revisited their correspondence in later years, rereading early passion with nostalgia. Children, upon discovering bundles of letters, sometimes encountered parents in entirely new ways, as young lovers rather than as authority figures. These discoveries bridged generations, connecting family histories through the written word. Today, many of these archives rest in public collections. Libraries, museums, and universities preserve them as cultural treasures. They remind us that love, though intensely private, also belongs to history. They allow us to hear voices otherwise lost, to glimpse the ways ordinary people navigated passion, distance, and duty. They show that intimacy is not only lived but written, and that writing, when preserved, can outlast even the lives of those who wrote. The phrase "letters that last" captures both the fragility and resilience of these archives. Paper is vulnerable to fire, water, and time. Yet against odds, thousands survive, carrying ink across a century. They endure because people chose to keep them, to honor them, to pass them on. In them, we find not only words of love, but the persistence of memory itself. Memory inked, folded, and preserved in the archives of intimacy. By the 1930s, America had entered a period of profound transformation. The optimism of the Roaring Twenties had given way to the hardships of the Great Depression. Families faced unemployment, poverty, and uncertainty. And these realities inevitably reshaped love, courtship, and marriage. Yet even amid hardship, romance endured, though it looked different than it had in the decades before. The early 20th century had been an age of handwritten letters, formal courtship rituals, and weddings steeped in tradition. The 1930s and the years that followed saw romance becoming more modern, more pragmatic, and increasingly influenced by technology, consumer culture, and social change. The Great Depression redefined the foundation of relationships. Economic security became a prerequisite for marriage more than ever before. Young couples delayed weddings until men could secure stable work, and engagements often stretched for years. Some marriages were postponed indefinitely, while others were abandoned under financial strain. Government surveys from the era revealed that couples consistently cited money as the greatest obstacle to marriage. For those who did wed, household economies dominated daily life. Love was important, but survival often took precedence. Courtship itself adapted to straitened times. Lavish outings and expensive gifts were replaced with simpler pleasures. Walks in the park, community dances, or evenings spent listening to the radio. Letters still circulated, but they often carried not only declarations of love, but updates on financial conditions, job prospects, and family hardships. In this era, intimacy was built not only on romance, but on resilience, the capacity to endure hardship together. Couples measured devotion in sacrifices, in shared resourcefulness, and in the willingness to face uncertainty side by side. Weddings reflected the climate of the Depression. Extravagant ceremonies became rare, replaced by smaller gatherings in churches, courthouses, or family homes. Brides wore practical gowns, sometimes altered from older dresses or repurposed from relatives' clothing. Receptions were modest, with simple meals and neighborhood gatherings. Yet these scaled-down ceremonies did not diminish their meaning. If anything, they highlighted the symbolic power of marriage in the midst of scarcity. To commit to love and unity was itself a form of defiance. despite economic pressures. New cultural influences began to modernize romance. Hollywood films of the 1930s set new standards for love stories, projecting ideals of glamour, passion, and witty companionship. Movies like It Happened One Night, 1934, and Gone with the Wind, 1939, shaped the fantasies of millions, even as their audiences endured poverty. The silver screen introduced images of love that blended realism with aspiration, encouraging couples to imagine romance not only as duty but as excitement and adventure. The Dadaio also transformed romantic culture. Love songs broadcast nationally gave couples shared soundtracks to their relationships. Crooners like Bing Crosby and Rudy Valley became voices of intimacy, singing directly into living rooms. Programs offered advice on marriage, dramatized love stories, and reinforced cultural norms of companionship. Radio made romance more immediate, creating the sensation that private longing was part of a larger cultural chorus. The telephone, increasingly affordable by the 1930s, further changed intimacy. Couples could speak in real time, shrinking the delays of letters. While not everyone had private lines, those who did used them to sustain relationships across towns or cities. The immediacy of voice, tender, direct, and unrehearsed, altered how affection was expressed. Letters remained central, but the telephone introduced a new layer of spontaneity. Love was no longer confined to ink and paper. It vibrated across wires. The Depression also reshaped gender dynamics in love. With so many men unemployed, women often entered or remained in the workforce, supporting families or supplementing incomes. This shift complicated expectations within marriage. Some men felt emasculated, while others adapted, embracing more egalitarian partnerships. Couples navigated these tensions privately, but the broader cultural narrative still emphasized men as providers and women as homemakers. Even so, the seeds of change were planted, setting the stage for further transformation during and after World War II. Race and class shaped these changes unevenly. African American couples, facing not only economic hardship but systemic racism, built relationships within communities of resilience. Churches, mutual aid societies, and cultural traditions reinforced bonds. Love and marriage were sustained not only through personal devotion but through collective endurance against oppression. Immigrant families, too, adapted traditions to Depression realities, blending Old World rituals with New World pragmatism. Romance was always lived within structures of inequality, but it remained central to survival and dignity. World War II, beginning in 1939 and drawing America in after 1941, accelerated the transformations begun in the Depression. Engagements were rushed, marriages took place in uniform, and letters once again became lifelines between soldiers abroad and partners at home. Wartime romances were marked by urgency as couples faced separation and uncertainty. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, further altering gender dynamics. The war created both temporary disruptions and long-term shifts, expanding women's independence and redefining expectations of love and partnership by the mid-20th century. Romance in America bore little resemblance to its form at the turn of the century. The handwritten love letter still existed, but it now competed with telephones, radios, movies, and, eventually, mass advertising that marketed romance as consumer culture. Engagement rings were by then firmly established as cultural necessities, thanks in part to De Beers campaigns of the 1930s and 1940s. Weddings became increasingly commercialized, with magazines and stores promoting the idea of the perfect day. Love itself became both deeply personal and publicly shaped by media, technology, and markets. Yet through all these transformations, one truth endured: romance adapted, but it did not disappear. In the 1930s, couples redefined intimacy under the weight of poverty. In the 1940s, they faced distance and loss through war. In each case, love was reshaped by circumstance, but preserved by determination. The changing face of romance reflected broader social changes, yet, at its core, it was still about connection, the human need to bind one life to another, to endure together through uncertainty. Looking back, the story of love in the 1930s and beyond reveals not only the resilience of intimacy, but also its fluidity. Love is never static. It is shaped by economics, technology, culture, and politics. The Americans who fell in love in Depression breadlines, who exchanged vows in modest chapels, who whispered affection over party-line telephones, or who clutched wartime letters, were part of a continuum, adapting old rituals to new realities. Their experiences remind us that love, while timeless, always wears the face of its age. As the first half of the 20th century unfolded, love in America was lived not only in gestures, rituals, and households, but in words preserved on paper. Letters captured emotions that could not be spoken aloud, preserved hopes across distances, and recorded the intimate struggles of couples navigating tradition, hardship, and change. By the 1930s, the culture of love had already transformed through technology, war, and economic upheaval, yet the legacy of letters endured as both practical communication and emotional archive, binding generations together with ink, memory, and devotion. The endurance of letters reminds us of the human need to preserve connection. Even as telephones, radios, and later technologies altered intimacy, letters retained a power that transcended innovation. They were tangible, physical objects, carrying not only words, but the very presence of the beloved. A folded page bore handwriting unique to the writer, a rhythm of strokes shaped by mood, personality, and education. To read a letter was to touch another person's hand across time. The materiality of ink and paper gave permanence to what was fleeting in voice or gesture. Throughout the early 1900s, couples understood that letters were more than temporary messages. They were testaments. Lovers often kept entire bundles of correspondence, tied with ribbon or stored in boxes, as if aware that these documents would outlast them. These collections became archives of intimacy, revisited during anniversaries, reread during quarrels, and passed down as heirlooms. The act of preservation turned private affection into historical record, ensuring that voices of ordinary people would echo long after their lives had ended. The content of these letters reveals the breadth of human experience. Some brimmed with tenderness, filled with endearments and declarations of eternal devotion. Others carried tension, reflecting misunderstandings or jealousy born of distance. Many chronicled daily life, weather, meals, family matters, mundane details that became profound in the context of longing. Together, they map a landscape of intimacy, showing how love was lived in rhythms both ordinary and extraordinary. The power of letters also lay in their endurance through hardship. During wars, they were lifelines, sustaining soldiers and families through absence and uncertainty. During the Great Depression, they carried reassurance across scattered households, reminding loved ones that survival was a shared endeavor. During pandemics and illnesses, they recorded grief and comfort, preserving the voices of those lost too soon. In each case, letters did more than communicate. They preserved humanity against forces of chaos and change. Historians today rely heavily on these preserved documents to reconstruct emotional lives. Archives in libraries, universities, and family collections hold thousands of love letters from the early 20th century. Their study has revealed not only private feelings, but also broader cultural patterns, how men and women expressed desire within constraints, how immigrants negotiated old traditions with new lives, how African Americans wove intimacy into struggles against racism, how soldiers balanced patriotism with longing. Letters are not only personal artifacts, but cultural texts, showing how love adapted to context. Yet letters were also fragile. Not all survived. Some were destroyed deliberately, burned in the wake of betrayal, divorce, or death. Others were lost to accidents, war, or neglect. The survival of any collection is itself a story of choice and chance. What we read today is a partial record, shaped by what people decided to keep or discard. Even in absence, however, we can glimpse meaning. The decision to burn letters reflects the danger and intensity of intimacy, the weight of words too powerful to preserve. By the 1930s, the culture of love was increasingly shaped by media and consumerism. Engagement rings, wedding ceremonies, and even honeymoons were promoted as commodities, while songs and films broadcast new ideals of romance. Yet letters remained central, resisting the ephemerality of mass culture. They were personal, unique, and irreplaceable. Even as couples listened to Bing Crosby on the radio or watched love stories on the silver screen, they returned home to ink on paper, words that belonged only to them. The legacy of letters endures, not only in archives, but in memory. Families preserve them as heirlooms, reading aloud the words of grandparents or great-grandparents, reanimating voices from another era. Museums and historical societies display them as cultural treasures, recognizing that they reveal dimensions of life absent from official records. To read a century-old love letter is to step into intimacy across time, to witness the persistence of hope, desire, and devotion in human history. Reflecting on this legacy, one truth stands clear: love is both timeless and historical. Its essence, the longing to connect, to belong, to endure together, remains unchanged. Yet its forms, its languages, its rituals shift with each generation. In the early 20th century, Americans expressed love within structures of duty, propriety, and constraint. But through letters, they found ways to speak freely, to preserve passion in ink, even when silence was demanded in public. These letters remind us that human hearts always seek expression, and that expression, when written, can endure far beyond its moment. As we conclude this journey through the intimate world of early 20th century America, the image that lingers is not of grand ceremonies or public scandals, but of quiet hands writing by lamplight, of envelopes slipped into mailboxes, carried by trains, opened in kitchens or trenches, of pages folded and unfolded until edges frayed, read until ink faded. In these fragile objects, we see the enduring legacy of love, love written, preserved, and passed on. The story of love in this era ends where it began, in silence and ink. Silence, because so much of intimacy could not be spoken aloud. Ink, because it preserved what silence could not contain. The legacy of letters is not only in the archives of historians, but in the memory of families, in the whispered readings of descendants, in the recognition that love, once written, can outlast even the lives of those who felt it.